Okay, if everybody could grab a seat, please, we'll get started. Good morning and welcome to day 2 of 6 of phase 3 of Power Forward. So today we are going to spend some time talking about two very specific subjects, electric vehicles and storage as a grid component. Remember, I went into this dialogue a little bit yesterday, but just remember what we're doing here. So the first 3 days of Power Forward Phase 3 will be spent talking about what we deem to be the distribution system platform, a combination of planning, operations, and markets. For operations, rather than talking about operations in possibly a somewhat esoteric manner, we decided to pick the two topics that we felt that were most relevant in the operations space today, and that is electric vehicles and storage. So we're really excited to have this discussion. The EV discussion and the storage discussion are two hot items right now. We know that other states are trying to figure out how to, from a regulatory perspective, contend with what we know will be an increased number of electric vehicles on our roads, an increased number of charging stations that will have to be deployed in order to meet this supply and demand. And so we're really excited to spend a good amount of time talking about EVs. With respect to storage, I've said this a couple of times during speaking engagements, but when I first started here at the agency, storage was definitely thought of as sort of a fringe topic. And now you have the FERC issuing orders associated with storage. You have what I think is some true investment in the space that I think as a regulatory group we are going to have to figure out how to handle. So again, an exciting day today. We are really excited to have with us Mr. Phil Jones, who is the Executive Director of the Alliance for Transportation Electrification, and he is known to us and in all regulatory circles as, Phil, we'll put you on the Mount Rushmore for us of regulators, and former president of NARUC, and I know somebody that we have, from a regulatory community perspective, have all interacted and admired for some time. So Phil, we're very grateful to have you here, and welcome to Ohio.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Commissioners. It's good to be back in the Buckeye State. I'll talk about a little anecdote of my history with Ohio in a minute here. But I really appreciate you organizing this workshop. As you say, storage, electric vehicles, and more specifically the infrastructure to support EVs is really important these days, so I'm very glad that you're focusing on it. So you've given me the opener today, so I'm going to set the stage a little bit over the next 15 minutes, maybe entertain some questions from you, and then I guess we move into the first panel. Very pleased to be here with this distinguished group of panelists as well. So overall big points. What are the factors that are really forcing this move toward EVs today? I'd say there are several. The first, of course, is technology innovation. And Mr. Chairman, you mentioned storage that you're taking up this afternoon, but look at the batteries. Look at the progress that we've made in developing lithium-ion batteries, higher capacities, cheaper, and it has just been amazing. The EV supply chain, all over through the automotive industry, which you're very familiar with in the state of Ohio. The EV supply chain has gotten better, cheaper. Britta Gross of GM will talk about that today. So I'd say the number one factor is innovation. Another one is grid modernization. So the issue with EVs is it's not just a way to charge the car, but it can be a grid asset. So we'll talk about that today during the panel. But how do you integrate these distributed energy resources smartly and intelligently into the grid? If we do it right, it works. If we do it wrong, it's going to be a mess because it's going to contribute to coincident peak load factors if people go home and charge from 4 to 6 p.m., for example. Customer engagement, another big factor. You're talking about this a lot in Power Forward, but the customer is engaged today as never before. Whether it's, I want renewables or I want clean energy, so the customer has the ability today through technology and through a lot of awareness to engage in EVs and the infrastructure. But we have a big job to do in outreach and education to those potential EV owners. Really don't need to mention environmental factors. Mr. Chairman, you and I, when I was president of NARUC, we dealt a lot with the Clean Power Plan, new administration, new things. But there's no question that the imperative to reduce greenhouse gases, to clean up the environment, NOx and other air pollutants is a big factor. Another big factor increasingly is the international factor. And just let me say China to get your attention. China and the European Union are going after this market in a way that we haven't seen for a newly emerging industry for a while. So if you're concerned about the future of the automotive industry over the next 10, 15 years, you should take this seriously. And then lastly, and I talked about this a lot when I was in NARUC leadership, but the silos, the generation silos, the distribution silos, all these silos that we traditionally break up in the regulatory paradigm under Mr. Bonbright's principles are kind of merging. And so we need to be a little more proactive, I think, in the way we approach those. Personally, I worked for the state of Ohio about 20 years ago. So I was based in Tokyo, working for Governor Rhodes at the time in economic development. And I got to work on attracting Japanese auto companies to the state of Ohio. And I'm glad to say that I was part of the project of Honda to get first the motorcycle plant and then the automotive assembly plant. So this was a long time ago. I've talked to, I think, Chairman Hawk and Commissioner Trumbold about this. So it's good to be back. I really haven't, I'm based in Seattle on the West Coast. I travel a lot, but I really haven't had the chance to get back to Columbus. So it's good to be back here, and I trust that Honda, Fujitec in Cincinnati, some of those projects I worked on are still good for the state of Ohio. So a little bit about the Alliance for Transportation Electrification. Today we have over 30 organizations. It's a 501c6 organization. We just launched this at the NARUC meeting in November in Baltimore. We consist of utilities, auto OEMs, the EV vendors, and other related trade associations. So we are just getting going. Our mission is to engage with commissions like you to try to stress the importance of this issue of transportation electrification. If I had to give you my elevator speech, it's three issues that the Alliance is focusing on. First is that there's an urgent infrastructure gap. You'll hear from Britta, the other panelists. We have a large number of EVs, both pure battery electrics and plug-ins, coming into the market over the next 3 to 5 years. If we collectively don't focus on the infrastructure gap, what I call, that there's not enough charging stations out there, we could be in trouble. Because if consumers buy the EVs and they can't go to their, quote, filling station to get the fuel, there's going to be some problems. So that's number one. There's an urgency here to address this. Secondly is the utility role. This is kind of a contentious issue, but the Alliance believes the utility has a very important role to play, either in owning the EV assets or in facilitating their deployment. Utilities are well positioned to assess where they should go in the grid and then either own and operate them or work with third-party vendors to make sure it's used for the benefit of all. Third issue is open standards and interoperability. In our view, we cannot afford to have another Betamax and VHS type of thing or a proprietary system getting into the marketplace and then another proprietary system comes in that doesn't communicate well, doesn't roam, with the other system. So we think you, the commission, even though it's a fairly technical issue, that you need to be aware of this, and maybe when you issue orders or policy guidance that you need to include interoperability in that sort of discussion. Specifically, the Alliance believes that OCPP, Open Charge Point Protocol, OCPP is probably the best protocol on the market today. It's been developed in Europe, in the Netherlands in particular, and we believe it should be used here. So what can you do as a commission, the 5 of you and your staff? Just a few words of advice and guidance. Be proactive. Recognize that you do have a positive role to play. You're not the only actor. You're an economic regulator, of course, and set just and reasonable rates. But it's important that you look at this issue not as an umpire calling balls and strikes. Some commissioners think of their role that way. A petition comes in, you adjudicate it, issue an order. This is the sort of issue, I think, that is kind of challenging, multi-sectoral, that you have to approach a little bit differently. Secondly, legislative direction. Mr. Chairman, you asked what's going on across the country. There's a whole series of things going across the country. Some states are taking it up in legislation, for example, in Pennsylvania. So probably in Pennsylvania there will be a bill that will provide some general guidance to the commission there, and then the commission will do its thing, issue policy guidance, and deal with other issues. In some states, like Michigan, the legislature is not acting, so the commission has to use its own authority to set just and reasonable rates and regulate in the public interest. So I don't know what the situation is like here in Ohio, and I'm not going to step into that minefield, but my ideal view is that if you can get some legislative direction, that helps, because this is kind of a new area, but you want to maintain your discretion, a lot of your discretion, to set what we call JNR rates and regulate in the public interest. So in that sense, even without legislation, policy guidance would be helpful if you have the ability, as I think you do under your rules, to issue some general policy guidance to the regulated utilities. A generic docket like this one, if you can keep it open, even if an adjudicated case come in, I think that's helpful, because these are kind of difficult issues that involve other state agencies and a large number of stakeholders, but allow the utilities to file specific proposals while the docket's open. The stakeholder process is really important, and I'm glad to see so many people in the room today. But it's important to have a robust, transparent stakeholder process, however you want to structure it. The Washington UTC, before I left, we issued a policy statement. I think I've shared it with your staff. If I haven't, I'll send it again to put it in the docket. But one of our key issues at the time was to empower staff to set up an open stakeholder process. And I think that has worked out very well. The other thing I would encourage you to do, if the utilities play a robust role here, and I think they will, is encourage them to use the portfolio approach. And let me mention why. DC fast charging, and we'll get into it today, DC fast charging does not pencil out on a business case, usually. So if you look at all the components of charging, level 1, level 2, workplace, then you have DC fast charging. It's very difficult to justify a business case. So if you use your traditional cost-benefit analysis on a standalone basis, it doesn't pencil out. And we can get into a discussion on this, but the portfolio approach allows you to put all the things together in a utility proposal, and to, if you will, you can spread the costs out among different rate classes. And this is controversial, I know, and you'll have industrial customers, you'll have all sorts of people weighing in on that, but you as the commission have the authority, I would argue, clearly to do that. Finally, specific to Ohio, what do I think is unique about Ohio? Well, as I said, as Ohio goes, usually the country goes. You have 11.6 million people. You only have 8,400 EVs. That needs to change. So whether the consumer pulls that, whether we focus on infrastructure that allows the consumer to get over the range anxiety, I would argue it's a combination of a lot of different things, but I think it just argues that we have a lot to do. The Columbus program that is here is a great case study of US DOT, Vulcan from my city of Seattle, where I live. Vulcan has been a big contributor to that. But that's the sort of partnership building and the sort of creative thinking that we need here in Ohio. And I'm not saying you need to replicate that for Cincinnati, Toledo, and Cleveland, and Dayton, but that sort of thinking and that sort of seed funding would be very helpful. Obviously, as I told you, I worked on the Honda automotive plant 20 years ago. I used to be in competition with the states of Michigan, Kentucky, Tennessee, over there in Japan and Asia, trying to get factories to Ohio. And you're in a competition here, I would argue. This is not your remit, economic development, but the automotive industry, I think, is really important to your state. So that kind of distinguishes you from my state or other states around the country. PJM, you're a big member in PJM. I know Commissioner Trumbull, you've been active on OPSI. If you have an ISO and RTO market like that, it allows you to do things with the aggregation of EVSC assets, putting a value on services where the EV assets can be used for demand response, storage perhaps. So this is an interesting thing where EV assets can become a bit of a platform on which different value streams can be identified and then worked up to the RTO. Retail choice, obviously, I mentioned consumer engagement. You in Ohio have struggled a bit with this, I know, but you are more of a retail choice state than my state and other vertically integrated states. So the idea of EVs and EV infrastructure coming into a state like Ohio, I think, makes a lot of sense. And then I think you have a good philosophy here, as evidenced by the Columbus program, of getting municipals, universities, Ohio State, or others to work together in what I would call a coalition of the willing. If you can do that, I think that makes sense. And also, I would encourage you to think regionally. Michigan, next week there'll be we have a generic workshop in Minnesota, like this one. We've been spending a lot of time in Michigan, your neighbor. Ontario has a very robust EV program and DC fast charging. So when you think, I urge you to think Ohio, of course, but I also urge you to think regionally with Ontario, Michigan, and your surrounding states, and make it easy for the consumer. Make these systems easier to roam among each other. And finally, the utilities, I think, as I said, whether it's AEP or First Energy or the others, they have scope, they have capabilities to do this, they have the ability to raise capital at fairly reasonable rates, and I think they're in it for the long term. Some of these other companies may not be in it for the long term, but I think the automotive companies and the utilities are going to be in this EV and EV infrastructure space for the long term. By long term, I mean 20, 30, 40 years. So I would urge you, that's my opening statement. I urge you to take these factors into consideration, and if we have a few minutes, I'll take some questions.
Very good. Thank you, Phil. I think, would we like to do questions for Phil now, or should we dive into the panel and just do collective questions that this wonderfully bright panel can answer? So, Phil, we'll probably do collective questions, if that's okay with you.
Thank you.
Great. Well, we have a wonderful panel with us. Thank you again, Phil. We've got a wonderful panel with us this morning. Let me go ahead and list, first of all, everyone's bios are available via the Power Forward website. So usually I just say names and titles, and I hope that's okay with our panelists. But we've got with us Britta Gross, Director, Advanced Vehicle Commercialization Policy for GM, Dan Bowermaster, Program Manager, Electric Transportation for EPRI, Katherine Stainken, Policy Director for Plug-in America, Sam Spofforth, Executive Director of Clean Fuels Ohio, and Dan Francis, the Manager of EV and Technology Policy for AEP. Welcome to all of you. Britta, you're slated to go first. Is that
Perfect.
Okay, let's go ahead and do that. Thanks.
And the clicker's right up there, Britta.
Perfect. Thank you, and Phil, thank you for that brilliant introduction. Thank you. I almost just could leave now because I think he said everything that's worth saying. But I will go through my slides anyway. So thank you, Chairman and Commissioners, for the opportunity. I can't tell you how exciting it is to get the attention of such a receptive group of really important stakeholders in this entire process. And what I've learned, if anything, in the 10 years that I've been working on EVs and bringing the Volt and the Volt EV to market, is how important this big system is, and that we're actually not making it with sort of the free system, the just everyone go and play your part. We need the help of some stakeholders that are key to actually getting us past this sort of chasm that happens every time you drop in brand new technologies that require much more of an ecosystem to be able to move into the market. It's a short-term issue. It doesn't have to last forever, but we're going to need some help because it's just not, infrastructure is just not showing up at the investment levels that it needs to show up. So let me walk through, the story of where we are and kind of where the market is and what I've seen in the last 10 years. So as you probably all know, you're probably very expert in EVs, and I'm not going to go into any of this detail here, but just be aware that there's a whole portfolio of architectures when we talk about plug-in electric vehicles, right? Some are plug-in hybrid electric vehicles. That would include even the new Chrysler Pacifica hybrid. That's almost an SUV or a van. It looks a little bit like a van crossover. Really nice looking vehicle. Very utilitarian, very functional vehicle. You've got BEVs, battery electric vehicles, the category of all electric vehicles on the right-hand side. You recognize there the Chevrolet Bolt EV, probably the Nissan Leaf and others. And then in the middle is this category that the Chevy Volt and Cadillac CT6 have kind of owned here, called extended range electric vehicles, where they are purely battery electric vehicles, so they drive just like the right-hand column BEVs, but when you run out of battery charge and no drop of gas is ever used, then they switch over to the gas engine. You can take a trip to Los Angeles today if you want to and just drive it like a regular gas vehicle. So just know that the spectrum, the space of architectures here is broad, and so it's not one size fits all. There are different infrastructure needs for all of them, but that's sort of the space. And there's a lot of creativity going on in that space as well. So here's data from Inside EVs. I check this website probably daily just to keep track and pull the last slide and see what's going on and check some more data. But this is you can see the bars represent different years, the colors of the bars. So you can see that in 2010, there were basically two cars for sale in the market. It was the Chevrolet Volt, it was the Nissan Leaf. And every year after, you can see the sales of the industry, plug-in electric vehicles. And what you start to see is that yellow bars exceed the black bars the year earlier, and green bars exceed the yellow bars the year earlier. What you see is that EV sales have now risen year over year for 29 months. So there is some really solid growth going on in the plug-in electric vehicle market. This is exciting. This is very, very exciting. And today there are about almost 800,000 plug-in electric vehicles in the United States. So year over year, 2017 over 2016, 26% sales growth. I'd like it to be a lot bigger number. I'd like consumers to be, racing into dealerships to grab these vehicles because they are that phenomenal. It's that important. These vehicles as a cost-saving technology, good for the environment, good for energy security. I'm not even going to go into those topics here today. But 26% year-over-year sales growth from 2017 over 16, solid. A solid growth number, and we continue to see those kinds of numbers. What we also continue to see, and this is just sort of so that you always have a reference point, what we continue to see, and this is data I've probably been showing. I know Dan Bowermaster's seen this chart for 10 years. He's probably sick of it. But we actually dug into the Department of Transportation data when we were designing the Volt, the Chevrolet Volt, this extended range electric vehicle, to try to understand how do consumers drive their cars today. And what the data showed is that 78% of Americans commute 40 miles or less every day to work. So we knew if that was the target for the battery range of the vehicle, we weren't putting too much battery on the vehicle so it would cost more, And yet we would be handling 80% of Americans commute daily, Monday through Friday, driving. And that became sort of this rallying cry in the range of an electric vehicle. And what's really interesting is that proved out in all the data on the Chevrolet Volt since 2010. That is exactly what's happened. 80% of the drivers are getting doing 40 miles or less, and all electric on the Volt. What's interesting is that today on the Chevrolet Bolt EV, which is our long-range battery electric vehicle that goes 238 miles, the longest range all battery electric vehicle that's affordable in the market today, the average daily driving on that vehicle is 43 miles. So even though they went and bought a vehicle with 238 miles on it, they can go further. They can go further on Saturdays and Sundays when they want to go to the parks and the rivers and do what they do on weekends and take the sort of unusual trips. But day to day, they're also doing about 43 miles a day. So it's really important to think about what's needed sort of Monday through Friday, where workplace charging plays a role, home charging. How do folks in apartments and condos drive their vehicles? How are they going to charge those vehicles? That's sort of the Monday through Friday challenge. But on weekends, it's all about the perception of where I could go. And that's where DC fast charging corridors comes in, as Phil mentioned here too. So I'm not going to read through this. We have made phenomenal progress on the technology side. That's on us. That's our job as automakers. If you just look at the first gen Volt that came out in December of 2010 on the left-hand column, and just scan your eye down the right-hand column, which is the second generation Volt, which came to market, what was it, maybe 2016? You start to notice there isn't a parameter here that isn't better. Better, faster, bigger battery, more range. Everything's better. I don't even know of a parameter on Generation Volt that didn't get better and more capable, and a more cost-effective battery on Generation 2. And the same can be said for our battery technology on the battery electric vehicles. So you can think of the Spark EV as our first generation electric vehicle. It went 82 miles. We weren't confident that was important to consumers, so we relegated that vehicle to sort of Oregon, California, and Maryland. And we were building, in the meantime, we were really focused on the Bolt EV with a better designed battery that really worked in an all-electric battery vehicle. And you see now, comparing first-generation technology, in a short 4 years later, we have now a battery on a vehicle that'll take you 238 miles. It seats more people. It's got bigger passenger space. It's faster off the line. And now, of course, it's available in all 50 states because now we know that is what consumers asked us for. And you don't have to ask just green car riders what they think about. This is not a green campaign. This is not about just being green and doing stuff for the environment. This is a win-win-win across the board. I mentioned energy security. I mentioned economic security. I probably didn't even talk about it. I won't even get into that today. But talk to car journalists. Talk to people that rate cars compared to all cars available in the market. Both the Volt and the Bolt swept every industry award available in the year they were introduced. Here you can see Motor Trend Car of the Year, North American Car of the Year, the two biggest industry awards that cars can be given. That's compared to all competition out there. All right, so where are we in the curve? We would say that we're a little bit beyond the innovators that just buy anything. They don't need much justification. They're excited about new technology. They're going to race out and buy it. We're through that phase. We're now having to prove these cars are made for them. And so we're sort of in this early adopter phase too. And so we would argue that we're still not in mainstream. We are very keen to start breaking into this early majority market, which is where sales come from, which is where scale comes from, and that's what also helps us get cost out. So to get there, we've got to do things like infrastructure, we've got to address EV awareness, and we got to continue to drive on us again the price of the technology out of these vehicles. Just as a one data point, there are 1 million of these kinds of data sources out there. In an Altman-Valandry study back in 2016, they did a national study, 2,500 respondents. They asked, what do you know about EVs? 60% knew little or nothing about EVs. We have a huge EV awareness problem. And this is going to be, I'm going to come back around to utilities and the role of utilities here because they are so key. They, unlike automakers and dealers, they touch every single consumer and every single corporation. We don't have that relation. We'd love to have that email list that they've got. We don't have that. So we have a lot more trouble getting the attention of consumers, and that's the strength of utilities and why we need to work collaboratively and in partnership. Of the 27% that know something about EVs but would reject them, they said it's because they would not consider them because there's not enough infrastructure. They do not perceive there's enough infrastructure to take them where they want to go, especially on Saturdays and Sundays. So, and if I just throw in one more data piece, the NREL, the National Renewable Energy Lab, has done some very nice work. It's a modeling exercise that came out just last September. In this thing, I just want to cite it because it's at least a set of numbers that are good as any forecast or assessment of how many vehicles could be in the market, and therefore how much infrastructure would be needed. So I go back regularly to this study as well. So they said, well, what if there are 15 million PEVs in 2030? I like that number because that assumes about 25% year-over-year growth. And I told you that last year, 17 to 16, we saw 26%. So 25%, pretty good. It's harder every year to get that kind of growth. So that's even a little aggressive. But if you look further into the study, it starts to lay out, so what would every state need? How much infrastructure? And I've just highlighted the Ohio line in here. For 15 million plug-in electric vehicles in 2030 nationally, Ohio's share, based on the way they adopt vehicles and the way they purchase vehicles, 393,000 plug-in vehicles in 2030. How much infrastructure to get to that point? Well, you'd need 11,900 workplace chargers, you'd need 8,000 public level 2 chargers, and you'd need, really importantly, 690 DC fast chargers across your state and in urban environments. So I just use that as sort of a benchmark, a place to start. The model and the analysis has a lot of sensitivity analysis. If you don't like those numbers, do your sensitivity analysis. I think they were actually very conservative in their analysis. They assume that every plug-in vehicle has access to a home charger. We know that's not true. We know that if you live in an apartment building or a townhome or condos, you don't necessarily have access to a charger. So it's actually, I would suggest, very conservative infrastructure numbers. So do we need utility engagement? Yes, we do. There is, Phil talked about no business case for DC fast chargers on a standalone single unit basis. I would offer there is almost no business case today for any infrastructure. I'm talking about the business case at home, at work, public level 2, or DC fast charger. The only business case I've seen in 10 years is what we're starting to see on these urban DC charging hubs that are supporting high mileage EV vehicles, like our Maven program, where we have Bolt EVs in 6 cities in the country. I'll talk about this a little bit later, but 6 cities operating 300 or 400 Bolt EVs, and where they're every day running so many miles they got to charge 1 or 2 times a day. That is a high use case, and we're starting to see a possible business case for high utilization stations in urban cores. So, but that's the first time I've seen something that indicates to any of us that there might be a business case here. So we have a problem right now, a gap, until we get enough consumers out there where they're using stations where there could be a business case. Consumers have to see more infrastructure or they're not going to buy the EVs. The business case will indeed improve over time, and the market will become more competitive with more players able to enter the market. But today, we need utilities to actively engage in all forms of infrastructure, home, work, and DC fast charging, and also engage actively in PEV outreach and education. If I just look specifically at Ohio, what's going on, I just went to the AFDC website and pulled a map of where the SAE DC fast chargers are, which most of the industry uses. And I'm looking at, in Ohio today, there are the 8,400 EVs today, plug-in EVs. There are 260 publicly available chargers, level 1, level 2, and DC in Ohio. The map shows your DC fast chargers. There are only 40 in the state of Ohio. They're all 3 in urban areas, so that's good. We have some stuff going on in these core cities. But if I want to drive from Columbus to Chicago, that's a 360-mile trip. And even the longest range affordable vehicle in the market today, actually even the most expensive electric vehicle in the market today, cannot make it to Chicago from here because we just don't have corridors. We have not established corridors. And that's not all on you, it's on Indiana too. But the point is we need to think about the state. Phil mentioned we have to think about the region. This is really important. Same thing from here up to Detroit. Boy, you'd be pulling in, I'd say fumes, but it's an electric vehicle, not a gas vehicle. But you know what I mean. You'd be sort of just very careful, especially on a cold winter day, trying to make it to Detroit from here. So we have a problem. But there are some things happening that are really important where we really keep an eye on and actually work with them essentially every day. One is Electrify America's national network of 300 plus DC fast chargers coming And they're building and putting them in the ground starting now. And by the end of next year, there ought to be a national network from coast to coast, almost the northern border, almost down to the southern border. That'll do a lot for consumer perception of where you can drive EVs. There's also funding through this Appendix D, this Environmental Mitigation Fund through the VW settlement as well. For Ohio, that is an $11 million opportunity, which is 15% of the allowable spend you could put into EV charging infrastructure. I pay a lot of attention to what the 50 states are doing with that fund. I would like to make sure that every state is really looking at that fund and will apply the maximum allowed 15% for EV charging infrastructure. So very, very important. I'm just going to skip right through that, Rita. It's great for doing, a thesis, but this is the learnings we have of the different buckets of infrastructure: home, work, public level 2, DC, high mileage, commercial use, and so on. And what's the solution for that? What's the near-term solution in our eyes? What's the longer-term solution? I leave that for your reading pleasure sometime. And then infrastructure efforts. There's the map from Electrify America. You can see what we expect to see in the ground from Electrify America by the end of next year. This is only the first cycle of investment. It does a lot for the perception. You glance at a map, you think, oh, I could really drive border to border. When you sort of zoom in, it's not enough, but it is a great foundational start. And what it means is that we can really target utility investment now very carefully, much more carefully, into filling the gaps that aren't covered by Electrify America, because that money also has limitations. And here's the map of the VW Appendix D funds that I talked about in the states. It looks like Ohio is a solid green. Sam, probably thanks to you and everyone else for your efforts in trying to help convince Ohio to invest in EV infrastructure. We really appreciate the efforts that you guys make down here. Fantastic. And I would just say 30 of 50 states now have either firmly confirmed they're going to spend 15% on infrastructure or very likely to, and they're just working through their draft plans right now. The others, gray is unknown, and I got a couple hot spots that I continue to work almost every day to get in there and talk to people and tell them why it's important. So scale matters when you're talking about EVs. There are individual benefits. These vehicles are quiet, which is my favorite benefit of these vehicles. They're quiet. I don't hear noise around the vehicle. They're exciting to ride, which is what most people call fun. Fast off the line. You can beat almost any car at an intersection. In fact, I would argue you could beat any gas vehicle off the line from a stop sign or a light. Fuel savings, you save money. The individual saves a lot of money in a year. Estimates are $500, $1,000, $1,500 a year, depending on what you're driving today. And this beautiful ability to wake up in the morning, just like my cell phone, and the vehicle is full of charge, and I don't have to worry about going to the gas station somewhere during my day to tank up again, because most Americans are driving 40 miles a day. And so that's easy to top off, even in a level 1 outlet, the outlets we see around here, easy, 10 hours overnight to get a full charge for all BEVs, PHEVs, EREVs. But there are also societal benefits for the economy, for the environment. Utility, there are going to be grid benefits because this is the smartest, largest, most flexible load, I would argue, the utility industry's ever seen. It's smart because we can command it to stop and start. As long as my vehicle's charged by 6 o'clock in the morning, do I care that the utility commanded my vehicle with my permission to stop charging between the hours of 10 and midnight because there was something else happening on the grid? I don't care. As long as my vehicle's fully charged, that's my preference, and that would be something I'd work out with the utility. I don't care. It's a flexible load, and that is going to really matter. We can do a great job of integrating renewables into the vehicles, wind at night, solar in the day, and all of this will apply downward pressure on all rates for all folks. So scale matters. We can't get to scale until we on us get the cost out of these technologies. We know that. We're working on that aggressively, but also infrastructure and awareness. Those are the two big impediments right now to the marketplace. And just a real quick, shout out for SMUD's data. This is getting a little old, this data. Maybe one of the utilities could offer me better data and more recent data. But this one caught my eye years ago. They studied what would happen on their grid, what would be the cost of the grid if they don't prepare for EVs. What you see at the very top blue line is the cost on their grid if everyone were doing a 19.2 kilowatt home charger. It would be expensive on their grid if they don't prepare. You go down from that, you see a 9.6 kilowatt charger at home. 6.6 is kind of what's happening today with most consumers on these level 2 chargers at home. 3.3 is where we started out with the Volt and the Bolt level 2. When you get down to 1.4, you're talking about just charging in your outlet. But if you manage charging, if you do this demand response or smart smart charging. The cost of the grid was almost negligible if you just prepare. And that for me was always the biggest takeaway. If we do this right, it benefits everybody. Almost to round out now, we have vehicles, electric vehicles in a couple other very advanced services. We are deploying Bolt EVs as we speak. We've got 400 right now in 6 cities. We call the platform Maven, LA, San Francisco, San Diego, Boston, Baltimore, DC. Lots of miles driven. The Lyft drivers, Uber drivers love these vehicles. We give them access. We actually pay for their fuel at DC fast charge stations. We work with cities, or we work with infrastructure providers or utilities, whoever owns and operates those stations, to get them access to the stations. What's really important to notice here is that these vehicles, these 400 vehicles, and not all have been operating all 12 months in the last year, have already given rides to 643,000 consumers in just those 6 cities. That's almost as many plug-in vehicles as been sold in the country in the last 7 or 8 years. So this as a sort of EV outreach tool is hugely important to us, and so we're leveraging that way. I'll also say that when we went to, I believe it's Boston or Baltimore, maybe it's Baltimore, we had to park 50 Bolt EVs for months because the infrastructure was not showing up fast enough. And we had a plan laid out to bring those vehicles into a car sharing program into the market. And without infrastructure, we can't do it to the drivers. We can't deploy them. So we are parking literally vehicles to make this happen. And then finally, EVs in our autonomous fleet. We have about 180 Bolt EVs that are also self-driving vehicles. They are being driven on real streets in San Francisco, over in Scottsdale, Arizona, in the Detroit area. Also plan to deploy them early this year in New York City. These are real vehicles. Notice that our autonomous vehicles are all electric, which means without DC fast charging in your urban hubs, we also can't support self-driving technology. We can't bring them to vehicles that don't have the infrastructure. So what will it take to grow the EV market? I think this is my last slide. We have to drive consumer demand. There's no way for us to force folks to buy these vehicles. We can't force them on them. We have to want them. We have to convince them to want these vehicles, so we have to build awareness. We have to charge infrastructure at a much faster pace. We need the help of utilities to do this, and we have to work on the affordability problem, and that's on us, and we're working on that as well. And with that, I want to thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Britta. Dan?
Great. Thank you very much, Britta. Good morning, everyone. Dan Bowermaster from EPRI. I'm going to talk a bit about this from the utility side. I think most people in the room are familiar with EPRI, but this is how I explained it to my family over Thanksgiving. We're a nonprofit group of really nerdy scientists and engineers that we do research on the entire electric grid, everything from generation down to customer use. Yes, we do get funding from the utilities as well as government, but since we're nonprofit, they may or may not like the results. But we're all about the data, and we're very honored to be here today, so thank you very much. So I'm going to talk about which EVs are here. Britta touched on it, so I probably will skip to that a little quick in the interest of time. And then also what's coming, and then from the utility perspective, a few things about the grid, and I was also asked to kind of comment on quickly on some research projects that some of the utilities have done across the country. So what's here? So there are about 782,000 EVs on the road. That number slightly different than Britta's, because this also includes the Tesla Roadsters from kind of the pre-2010 days. And as you can see on the map, they're across the U.S. They're definitely hot spots around the country where sales are higher, and in some counties the numbers are even high as 13-14% on a month basis. In other counties it's much smaller than that. But what's coming? And I think this is the part that's really important. So if you look out to 2020, I love this slide because it's always wrong every time I present it. So now the number is 93 individual EVs have been announced by the automakers out to 2023, and this is specific vehicles. This is not the grant. There are a lot of in addition to this, there are the big headlines saying, we're car company X, we're going to do 25 electric vehicles by 2025, et cetera. This is different than that. This is individual announcements, and what I think is important here to look is that pink category at the bottom, the kind of SUV crossover market, which has definitely gotten really blurry. I'm a car guy. It's very blurry now, but the point is that is a very hot market, not only in the U.S., but Britta talked about it's a global market, and even I lived overseas for 4 years, and even Europe and places like that where it might have been the idea of an SUV is kind of poo-pooed not that many years ago. It's also taking out China the same way. So the point is like there are more and more cars that and vehicles, big and small, that customers are buying. Even up the road here in Toledo, Jeep announced that in 2 years they're going to have a plug-in Jeep Wrangler. So the point is like you're going to see more and more of these. Britta showed the mini plug-in minivan. There are more there are more cars coming that customers demand. There are a few gaps. I'll be honest. I think the two big gaps are right now anyway, there's kind of unequal distribution across the country. What I mean by that is, in some of the states you have maybe up to 40 vehicles that you can pick from. In other states you might have 3 or 4, and it really depends on. I think again that's more of a short-term problem. As time goes on, as the regulations increase, as competition increase, you'll see more kind of scale across the country. And the other issue is I'll be honest, there's no giant body on frame, plug-in pickup truck or big SUV that's been announced yet. And I think everyone in the room knows that the top 3 best-selling cars year after year in the States are usually the big pickup trucks from the big 3. So that there is a gap there. But again, I think I'm not privy to insider information at the car companies, but we'll see what they're working on. Now, this is a subset of that data, and what I want to highlight here is something that Britta mentioned, and that is the range is increasing. Battery prices are dropping, the other power electronics, the other components are dropping, and again, it's all about getting to scale. How do the car companies launch these vehicles, bring out their second generation vehicles, and the supply chain gets pulled up to support that. And you can see the average driving range increasing for the fully electric vehicles. Again, at the car shows, you're starting to see vehicles big and small. These pictures are taken at the LA Auto Show last December. You have big SUVs like the Range Rover. You have not to call out anyone, but the VW plug-in VW bus, which will come out in 2022. All electric, very popular. Jaguar just this week announced a vehicle that'll charge at 100 kilowatts DC. The point is there's more and more vehicles coming. And I think something that we haven't talked much about yet is that it's not just the light duty cars. It's not just the cars that are out in our garages. It's all the vehicles. There are buses, electric buses right now across the country, around the world actually, with that are being deployed and tested. There's school bus demonstration going on, about 20 school buses in the Central Valley of Sacramento. You see there are different pilots for garbage trucks. Tesla semis made the news, the Navistar, VW truck group, Daimler's truck group, everyone is talking about these. So the point is it's not just the light duty vehicles. And, from a utility, from a social perspective, that has quite a few implications as far as air quality. From a utility perspective, that's a lot of power and energy. I mean, now we're talking about charging rates 150 and up, not just for light duty. And I think that's, something, it gets a lot of headlines. And, I think Britta nailed it. It's important. We're all human, right? And we're used to getting gas in our cars, and it's what we do. And so when we think about electric vehicles, the normal question is, how long does it take to charge? And there's an answer to that question. And the short answer is, I don't know. And plug it in at night when I get home, and there's ideally there's an easy one-step setup. And as we mentioned earlier, it's like as long as it's charged by 5 a.m., 6 a.m. the next morning. Me, the customer, I don't care. So it's not about, how long does it take? It's like it's easy, it's nice, and you get that thrilling feeling in the morning when you drive your 40 miles or 20 miles one way to work, and that's great for the overnight and for the commuting. That it is also important. It's like if that's say anywhere from 70 to 80% of the charging, then there's also there is a need for public charging. And by 70 to 80%, I also include workplace in that. But there is a need for kind of the top of the pyramid, the public charging. That's for the long distance trips. That's for the people without garages. That's if you're running an errand on that Saturday before Christmas and you want to drive that next town over for dinner after you've gone shopping. It's that kind of thing. And the urban core that Britta mentioned, it's very, very challenging. The people who live in condos and apartments might not have access to even a 120 plug where they park their car, or even a garage. So there's definitely a role for public charging. And when you think about these charging levels, utilities can support this load. They do this all the time. It's a question of, again, how do you do this at scale? How do you do this cost effectively? When you think about a charging plaza, whether it's for a fleet of city transit buses, or if you're trying to drive between here and in Nebraska on I-80, and it's out, it's a 2 to 5 to even maybe 10 megawatt load. How do utilities cost effectively serve that? How do they work with the stakeholders in serving that load? And that's some of the issues that the industry's working really hard on right now. And by really hard, this is probably the most cluttered slide I've created in recent memory, but bear with me. So the goal is, what we're trying to do here is capture all of the utility EV charging infrastructure programs that are going on across North America. Now, Utilities have been working on EVs, and they have EV programs, some for more than a decade. So that's not shown here. What this tries to show is what's going on, what's the dollar value, what's kind of the structure in case you want to get into the details of who owns it or what part, and then how many have they actually installed. And you can see there's a significant amount of work going on, even across the border here over in Canada on EV charging infrastructure. And I think, the point, you'll probably hear this again and again from different stakeholders, it's not just about the charging infrastructure, which is a lot of the discussion, it's also about that customer education piece. We've kind of done this before, and utilities touch every customer, big, small, rural, urban, et cetera, so that, EPRI can't do policy, but you can't stay as a fact that, utilities touch everyone. So, there's the opportunities you see that for utilities to figure out with their stakeholders how to best do that. And I don't think that education piece can be stated enough. So then the question we get all the time, and this makes some people kind of angry, is can the grid handle it? And the short answer is yes, it can. But here's some data. So first thing is this shows kind of power from individual electric vehicles, whether it's a fully electric or plug-in hybrid, and it's lower than you might think. It's it's about a kilowatt for power. And energy impact, it kind of depends on how you drive, but it's on average 2,800 kilowatt hours a year, so it's between 2,500 and 3,500 is kind of the data. So the point is it's great load. And as I have this mud chart too, and mine will see that in a second. The thing is, and this kills me, I'm a car guy, this kills me, if you look at the data, but cars sit around at home and work 21 hours a day. It's actually slightly more than that. So the point is to drive that 40 miles on average, you actually, even if you charge at level 1, which again is not a big deal, it's just a microwave. If you charge it, level 2 or something like that, you only need the utility only, or the customer only needs a couple hours a year, and so there's quite a bit of potential there to actually move that around. So how do you do that at scale? How do you make it easy on the customer? That's some of the challenges the utility's facing right now. So about the question of grid can handle it. So what this graph shows is that generation capacity and kind of how it flows through, and how much goes to industrial and commercial and residential. But on the y-axis, instead of megawatt hours or terawatt hours, it shows it in terms of EVs. And so the point is basically the grid generates enough electricity to support 1 billion electric vehicles, which kind of sounds, that's a huge number. So, but the point is, and I think people know, well, it's not just about the existing generation. It's about how much more would the grid need in order to support electric vehicles. So now we'll look at kind of supply on the supply side. So this looks at the grid in 5-year chunks back to right after World War II, and adding generation, again, the y-axis in terms of a number of electric vehicles per year. The utility industry can add generation, and as we saw kind of on on previous slides, it's unlikely that utility will have to add generation, but the point is it's more than possible. So the fact can the grid handle it? It's a bit of a the grid can handle it. It's again a question of cost and kind of speed and that kind of customer experience. I looked at capacity too. I took that out. It's just basically the same thing. Here's the SMUD graph. I'll echo what Britta said. So it's all about the power level and the time of the day, and if you can do that via an easy, scalable, smart charging program, that's actually kind of a net win for everyone, regardless if the customer drives an electric vehicle or not. It puts downward pressure on rates. You're getting more throughput on relatively the same amount of asset base. And I think that's also an important point to talk about. So can we be smarter? Can we improve? Absolutely. There's a lot going on, and I just want to call out a couple programs that are pilots that utilities across the country, and I specifically did not pick California. I'm from California, but I've lived in 25 different spots, including the Midwest and the East Coast, so I get in Texas, so I get it. So I took 2, SRP and PEPCO, and I'll talk about this briefly, and we can talk about it more in detail. So SRP, just you might have seen this in some headlines last month, but they're finishing up. It's basically, so they signed that they have outreach to their electric vehicle drivers, and they asked them if they wanted to join this vehicle pilot. It's 101 customers. SRP handles the outreach and kind of customer management, and they meet at night and they get their feedback. It's a lot of customer touch, and then they put data loggers on the car and they tracked where the cars go, how people charge, do they charge at public, home, work, that kind of thing, with pricing, that sort of thing. What they found, and the bottom line is that TOU, at least for this 101 customer pilot, was very effective at getting customers to shift loads. So that's SRP. Now jumping to the bottom, PEPCO, and this is about a year and a half old now, did something similar. Also 101 customers, interestingly, coincidence. They had similar, meaning they had rates that the customers could pick from, but of those 101, they also took 50 and gave them a smart charging station, where it was, again, back to that customer preference. The customer would say, hey, as long as you charge my car by X or Y time, Monday through Friday, and Z time on Saturday, Sunday. You Pepco can do whatever you want. And then there were basically demand times during the summer where there were peak days, and the charging would be reduced, not stopped, but reduced from level 2 to level 1. And then the customer also, on top of that, not only did they get education notification, but they also had kind of like 3 opt-out where they could, someone in the family was pregnant or sick and they just wanted their car charged during those times anyway. They could, without consequence, they had 3 kind of like opt-out opportunities. So that was similar, and they found that, again, it was a very popular program. They found out actually that most cars were not even plugged in during the time of peak grid demand, so there was just that foundational good thing to start with. So on top of that, the utilities and automakers, everyone's looking at different ways to talk to the cars. But again, it's less about how do you talk to the cars, or can you? And you can definitely talk to the cars, you can talk to the charging stations. How do you do this cost effectively and scale? And an example of it's this open vehicle grid integration platform that the automakers and utilities are looking at in different ways in different use cases across the country. I think the point there is it gets at, regardless of the technology on the car or the station, it lets the utility via open standards look at customer preferences and availability and balance that with what's going on with the grid, so then they can offer different programs and control signals and things like that. So again, it gets back to that scale question. And what that is actually leading to is a vehicle-to-grid project going on right now with actually Honda, Chrysler, some utilities, and EPRI, where we've developed this. It's putting power back on the grid. Now, back on the grid might not be, flowing it back up through the grid. It might be more just the house. But if you look at these different, again, to answer the question of scale, it's not just about EV charging. It's home loads. It's energy storage. It's solar. We're working on this, basically, we call it this smart power integration node that kind of balances all these things. Again, makes it easy on the customer and helps do this energy management. Again, trying to get at that scale. So the point is, these are just 4 highlights of different projects going on right now across the industry. There are probably 4,000 different projects we could talk about here, but in the interest of time, I just wanted to highlight those that I thought would be most applicable to what we're talking about today. So to close, today and tomorrow, enough. Yeah, what they say, what did Yogi Bear say about the future? You're always wrong. But the point is this stuff is happening very, very fast. I took that picture on the upper left there of the 3 white vehicles out my front door. So I worked in a factory. I was the boring factory guy during the dot-com time in the Bay Area, and kind of watched that wax and wane. And had you told me back then that private companies would be buying or leasing buses to move thousands of people around, and this would happen in big cities all across the country basically to supplement other forms of transport, I would have laughed at you back in 1999. Well, that's common occurrence now. Same thing you can see there. There's an electric vehicle parked on the curb, and there goes in the middle there, you see a white autonomous car driving by. So the point is, like, this stuff is happening very, very fast. Nobody quite knows what the final results are going to be, but the automotive industry and other stakeholders are putting in billions into this, and the utility is going to continue to play a large role in a variety of ways to customers, big and small. So thank you very much for your time. I look forward to the questions.
Thank you, Dan. That was funny. Thanks, Dan. You might be most valuable player, funny guy so far. That's right, and tallest. That is true. That was true. That mic was fully extended. Okay. Catherine.
Yes, good morning.
Good morning.
How are you all? Well, I'm the 4th speaker today, so unfortunately now you're going to hear some of the same information already and see the same slides, but we'll see how well you've been paying attention
smart slide? Yeah.
so far. I don't have the SMUD slide, but I have some of the how far people drive in a day slides. So I'm Katherine Stainken. I'm the policy director with Plug in America. So let me first just tell you about who we are. Maybe you've never even heard of us, but we're the voice of the current EV driver and the future EV driver. So I'm just curious, on the commission, does anybody drive an electric vehicle right now? Or a plug-in hybrid? No. Okay, well, I expect that to change in the next 1 to 3 to 5 years. So Plug in America, we focus on a bunch of different areas here. Education and outreach is our big thing. We're consumer facing, and our sole mission is to get more of these EVs on the road, whether that's purely battery electric or the plug-in hybrid. It doesn't matter to us. If it's got a plug, we want to see it on the road for a variety of reasons. We also focus on policy. I do our work on the ledge and the reg fields on the states, federal and the state level. As I said, we're very into the consumer experience. So we've got a dealer training program, which I will touch upon in a little bit. We've got a great website that answers a lot of questions for consumers. We have a quiz on there that will help all of you. And I encourage you all to take it now. Since you don't drive electric yet, you can find out which car is going to work best for you. And then we also do a little bit of research, too, not quite to the extent that EPRI does, but we do survey our drivers and see how long their battery's been lasting. Are they having problems finding charging stations, what's been broken, that kind of thing. And then we're also one of the co-organizers of National Drive Electric Week, along with the Electric Auto Association and the Sierra Club, and I'll touch upon that again in a minute. So 6 lessons here for you all to keep in mind as you're moving forward, examining the EV industry. And lesson number 1, always keep your consumer driving behavior in mind. So Britta, she kind of stole the thunder a little bit already, but I'd just like to emphasize that this is really important. So surveys help, know your customers, the ratepayers, and there and back again, a hobbit's tale. No, just kidding. There and back again, the average person drives 30 miles in a single day and build the charging infrastructure accordingly. So let's take a look at some of those surveys that are out there. So I think Britta has a similar survey that she mentioned, but really with this, the Federal Highway Administration National Household Travel Survey, that was done in 2009. They usually do these about every 10 years, so we're expecting one to come in the next year to 2. But the data hasn't really changed that much. About 70% of vehicle trips, they're starting at and ending at home. So that's a high percentage, and that's something important to keep in mind. And then also that next statistic there, looking at how many households have, are they mobile or manufactured homes, and then what kind of access to parking do they have? Now, there are some other surveys that are out there that are a little bit more recent. Consumers Union did something about consumer driving behavior. The Union of Concerned Scientists did one as well, and then Clean Technica also recently did one. So let's dive into that travel survey, though, a little bit further, just to really drive home the point about how far consumers are driving. So looking at home-based trips versus non-home-based trips, and remember, at home, you're likely going to have a charger. You definitely have access to level 1 charging, which is 120 volts, but you might install a level 2 charger as well. But if you're not starting at home and you're leaving from the workplace to go to, I don't know, shopping or something, you're probably driving about 30 miles. The percentage of trips that are more than 30 miles, it's really small. You can see those are about 1% or less than 1%. And for the home-based trips, again, it's that magical number of 30 miles. Britta was saying 40 miles, so between 30 and 40. But again, you can, this is going to help you to plan the charging infrastructure accordingly. Lesson 2, level 1 charging is proven to be effective and important. Now, before all of the charging station companies that are in the room behind me jump down my throat on this one, I'll say, however, so I'd like to just talk about level 1 for a minute. So as the speakers before me were saying, this is AC charging at 120 volts. You can get it from a normal household outlet. You don't need any other charger. You can just plug in and it'll work. And there are a number of reports that are out there that I encourage you to take a look at. One of them is the Department of Energy's report on level 1 charging at the workplace. This was done in 2016. It provides a really good analysis of some workplaces that started only deploying level 2 and then decided actually the consumers prefer a mix of level 1 and level 2. The Sacramento Municipal Utility District, they offer a rebate for their workplace charging program to do level 1. And then also in California, there's some guidance documents that talk about level 1 too. Okay, so now enough about level 1. But one more thing I just wanted to mention. So how many drivers actually use level 1 compared to level 2? So if we look at the Nissan Leaf, that's a very popular model that many consumers have, it's about 25 to 30% of the drivers use level 1. If we look at the Tesla Model S, about 5% of drivers use Model 1. Makes sense, bigger battery, you want to make sure that you're fully charged in the morning. The Bolt drivers, about 30% of them use level 1, and then with the Volt, with a V, it's about 50% of the drivers using level 1. Okay. So remember that point you were holding there, but we still need a healthy mix of level 1, level 2, and DC fast charging to meet the growth that is coming. And I know this has been emphasized already by the previous speakers, but there is an insane amount of growth that we're expecting in the next 1 to 5 years with electric vehicles. So in the short term, we really do need these workplace charging programs that offer level 1 and level 2. We need public level 1 and 2 at multi-unit dwellings. We need rebates for these programs. And then we need public level 2 in places where drivers are parked for a long time. Maybe not so much at the grocery store, maybe, where you're going in for 30 minutes or whatever, but at the movie theaters, at transportation hubs, places at the airport where your car is parked for a long time. And then we do need DC fast charging at mobility centers and corridors. Inciting DC fast chargers, I think, approximately 50 to 60 miles out from an urban center, which is kind of the range where customers feel comfortable with. That's where you need to be looking to place these DC fast charging stations. And in the long term, we need to be looking at building codes. As you can see there, the retrofit costs, just per charging space, if you can plan ahead with the raceway, the panel capacity, and the dedicated branch circuits, you'll avoid between $4,000 and $7,000 per charging space, and that is significant. So when we look at the low-income communities and the disadvantaged community experience, I'll touch upon California because that's what I'm most familiar with, although I live in Arizona. So there's no easy one-size-fits-all solution to the low-income communities and the disadvantaged communities. So California has this advisory board that's to look at, that their Public Utilities Commission created to look at this disadvantaged communities and low-income and what can be done. They did a study that just came out last year that looked at the barriers to clean transportation, and their recommendations were the sector needs a lot more funding, education and outreach, and various rideshare and mobility options. Also in California, there's a vehicle financing assistance program. This just started up, so we don't necessarily have the lessons learned yet, but it's a $900,000 program that combines the loan loss reserve program with a vehicle price buy down. And then finally, with the utility programs in California thus far, the utilities have all allocated between 10 and 15% of their budgets to deploy charging infrastructure within low-income communities. And now as these utilities move forward to larger and broader transportation electrification programs, that number has increased. It's different across all the different utilities, but I don't think it's anything more than 30% right now. And in terms of the rebate for doing those charging stations within those low-income communities, there is no cost to the site hosts in those communities of low incomes to install the charging station. Lesson 3. So drivers are okay with charge control until they're inconvenienced and mobility is impacted. So this is for sure, no one wants to get stranded out there. No one wants to wake up in the morning and find out that they don't have a full charge and they can't get to work. So Dan touched upon this with some of the programs that he's researched, but I encourage you to look at the BMW, the iCharge Forward program, and some of the quotes up there. I'll just read that second one. So among the 4 potential program features tested, participants ranked the ability to set a time their car would need to be at the desired charge level as most important. So that time is crucial because they want to be sufficiently charged for their commute. Okay, so this is kind of the bread and butter here. The education and outreach programs are critical. So when we're looking at this, where can we bring the education and outreach from? We've got utility programs, we have National Drive Electric Week, various state marketing campaigns, dealer training programs, and other consumer engagement type of programs. So when it comes to the state marketing campaigns, Ohio has the Drive Electric Ohio program. Denver has something called Pass Gas. Massachusetts has Mass Drive Clean. Georgia's got Electrify the South. New York, Drive Electric New York City. There's a range of various programs out there, but there's nothing right now that is really, even in California, there's the Veloz program, but there's nothing that has the dedicated funding level that's needed to be pushing consumers to make the switch to driving electric. So this is why utility program investment is really needed in the education and outreach sector. So I'll just take an example from Pacific Gas and Electric. I actually like their program there. It combines a lot of various factors. Not only are they marketing to their core program there about the infrastructure and getting site hosts engaged with installing and maintaining the infrastructure, but they're trying to do broader EV awareness too. And so under that point there on broad EV awareness, they've provided a driver kit for their employees and tenants to help encourage their, for supporting and getting more site hosts out there, because some of their customers are going to be the customers that are driving electric are the biggest champions now to help get those site hosts to be involved in wanting to host a site, a charging infrastructure site. And there are definitely metrics for evaluating the success of these education and outreach programs. So I've listed that example there. Again, that's from PG&E, but we really encourage utilities to get involved in this. So I would say, so far with the funding, you're probably interested how much has been spent on education and outreach so far. It has not been a lot, and this is a huge deficit, as I've been saying now. So in California, out of the $197 million that's been allowed so far and approved by the commission there, only $13 million has been dedicated to education and outreach. So $13 million, again, out of the total $197 million. I guess it could be maybe about $15 million, actually, because with the San Diego program, there was no line item specific for education and outreach, but we know that they're going to, for sure, spend some money on that. But this is a really small number, and we hope that going forward around the country, that we'll see commissions allow more funding to be spent on education and outreach. In Oregon, Pacificor, they just got approval for a $1.1 million education outreach program. And then, as another example, on the other side of the country, Delmarva Power in Delaware, they have programs between $100,000 and $300,000 on education and outreach pending. Dealer training programs, this is another way to a way for utilities to be involved in the EV sector and to get more adoption going. So the dealer training program that we have, it's intended to help grow EV sales by ensuring that consumers get the information they need to decide if an EV is right for them. So we deliver this online shopping experience that's similar to Edmunds.com, where you can take a variety of quizzes, see what works for you, what incentives are available, etc. And what the dealer gets out of this then is focused sales training, a one-stop online place to send their consumers to, their potential buyers to. They get new customer leads and appointments, and then lots of sales collateral and references. And then someone mentioned showing consumer demand. I think it was you, Dan. So this is an initiative called the Next Car Pledge that is being now promoted across the country, which is to show the consumer demand. So we hope that it'll start to be taken up here in Ohio, and this will show the automakers everywhere that consumers want these cars and there's growing demand. Okay, another key component here is consumer protection, and I know this is something that all of you will care greatly about. So really, these five principles of consumer protection, they strengthen and increase and helps increase the market size and give consumers confidence. So open access, that's something that goes without saying, kind of, it's can I get a charge? Can I show up to the charging station and have the ability to pay for what the service I'm going to get? So either via credit card swipe or some kind of mobile app. This isn't so much a problem really anymore. Back in the day, as charging stations were coming online, some things were proprietary. For example, the Tesla supercharging network, it's still proprietary to Tesla, but it could be that system is opened up for all drivers everywhere. But right now, for the low-income consumers, actually, not all of them have credit cards and not all of them have smartphones. So this is something maybe that needs to be examined a little bit further in the low-income communities, that open access issue. Transparency, again, this isn't too much an issue now, but consumers need to know how much that they're paying, what are their roaming charges, are they in-network, out-of-network, that kind of thing. Is there a demand charge as well for DC fast charging? That's something very important to keep in mind. Interoperability, this is a big issue right now that we're paying very close attention to. And interoperability can be defined as 5 different things depending on who you're talking to. So there's kind of the consumer-facing side of interoperability, and that's with the billing standard. But then there's the back-end side, which is with the sharing of the data and with some of the software protocols. But really for the consumer side, it's, am I part of this charging station network club or am I not? For example, you don't want to show up to a station and find that you're not a member of their network, and so then you have to go online, fill out the paperwork, wait 24 hours to get approval, and then you could get your charge. If you had to wait around 24 hours at the charging station, forget it. You're tossing out your EV and buying your gas car again. So this is something that we are encouraging all commissions to really look at and work together on. And finally, just a note here about charging rates. Really keep them simple and low. I don't have too much more to say here, but consumers like simplicity. This is a new technology for them. It's a new lifestyle. It's different than charging or than filling up with your regular gas car. It's more like your cell phone, as Britta was saying. But to the extent that charging rates can be kept simple and low, and especially the demand charges on DC fast charging to be kept low, that's going to be a key to seeing further growth in this sector. And that's what I have.
Katherine, thank you very much. Sam?
Well, good morning, Mr. Chairman and members of the commission and staff. I'm Sam Spofforth with Clean Fuels Ohio. I'm the executive director, and as I think most of you know, but just briefly, we're a statewide nonprofit organization. Our entire focus is on the transportation, energy, and technology sector, and so that includes natural gas, it includes propane, biofuels, electric vehicles, hydrogen, but really trying to facilitate a transition from petroleum-based fuels to vehicles that are more efficient and use an alternative that's domestically available. So, let's see. Just an overview of the presentation. I'm going to give a brief national context, but really I'm going to go through that fast since the other speakers have really done that. Talk kind of zero in more on the Ohio specific situation and challenges that have faced here up till now. And then hopefully that we are in the process of working through. I think 2018 stands to be a year of big change in Ohio. To kind of focus in more specifically on the current state of affairs with infrastructure for electric vehicles in Ohio, especially fast charging infrastructure, and then talk about some recommendations. So first, just a snapshot of the growth in the EV market and kind of where Ohio stacks up within that. This is 2015 data, and so the kind of the beige states are the lowest number of EV owners per 1,000 vehicles, and so Ohio, as you can see, is a little less than half of 1% of the total market is people owning electric vehicles as of 2015. And just kind of get a sense of the rest of the country. You see, California and the West Coast. A lot of that growth there has been driven by utility programs, which were really early in the market there, and also probably even more so by the fact that these are zero-emission vehicle states. And so we've seen a lot more concentration of models being available in those states compared with other states. You'll notice Georgia is also shaded green there. That's because Georgia had a very generous incentive, now since expired, for electric vehicles that really drove a lot of adoption there. So contrast that with just 1 year later, we're seeing a lot of growth, and Britta made this point. Just one thing I'd want to point out is Missouri, right in the middle of the country there. If we were to look at a slide from 2017, particularly the Kansas City area, that was the fastest growing market for electric vehicles of any market in the country. And the reason for that was investments that Kansas City Power and Light decided to make in the charging infrastructure. That is really what it's not that there were more models available all of a sudden in Kansas City, at least not right away, but that investment by the utility really drove a lot of adoption. So again, ZEV states that really that explains a lot. Not everything, but it certainly explains a lot. That along with the utility programs, as others have mentioned. So let's talk a little bit about early efforts in the EV market in Ohio, because we do have a little bit of a history here in Ohio, just in terms of what's been happening with electric vehicles and charging stations. So first was the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act. As many people may remember, back in the Obama administration, started in 2009. So our organization was fortunate to be a recipient of one of these grants, one of the 25 that were awarded through the U.S. Department of Energy's Clean Cities program. And then during the 2011 to 2012 period, the overall grant, I should say, was $11 million. But during this 2011 to 2012 period, part of our grants were for a number of electric vehicle charging stations. And so we do have some lessons learned from that. 43 locations, and there were other grants that we gave in terms of, natural gas stations, natural gas vehicles, propane, et cetera. So I'm just talking about the EV charging portion of this. So just some examples, the Ohio State House Garage, as I guess most people are aware, has electric vehicle charging. That was a Recovery Act grant that we gave. Ohio State University, a couple of other chargers that were funded that way. The City of Bowling Green and Bowling Green State University received some funding there. And then the Jeffersonville Mall between Columbus and Cincinnati, again, some level 2 public charging there. And these are just examples of the 43 charging locations. So in terms of some lessons learned, what we saw from the data was that the workplace charging locations that were funded were the most heavily used, and this is by quite a lot. So in cases of, the Ohio State House Garage, that's considered workplace charging. There are some other workplace charging grants that we awarded, those have been and are being very well used. In terms of the public or retail sites, some were well used and some were not. And in some cases, the usage ramped up over time. But the biggest factor in terms of how successful or how well used a public level 2 charging station was location. And then also, signage and promotion of the station is really critical. And I'd add a third, which is the consumer amenities that are available at that location. Those are all important factors for success. So then the next effort here around the electric vehicle market in Ohio is our launch of our Drive Electric Ohio program in 2013. And that featured initially another grant from the U.S. Department of Energy to help develop an Ohio electric vehicle readiness plan back in 2013. I will admit, it's maybe a little bit ahead of its time, but still there were a number of things that we learned and that we gained from that. As I mentioned, it was DOE funded. A snapshot of the state of the market in Ohio at that time. We did a kind of a high-level charging infrastructure needs analysis, more on in terms of corridor charging, DC fast charging at that time. We did a survey of local government leaders in that report. We also did a consumers survey in that report. And then we devoted an entire separate volume of this readiness plan to a detailed analysis and recommendations of local government policy, some state government policy recommendations also, but a lot of it was focused on some local government policies that we need and still need in Ohio, and then some best practices there. So just to switch to, what are the challenges that we face in Ohio specifically? So one is poor availability. So 2016, 22 different EV models available in California, only 8 in Ohio. And then we see also some not such EV-friendly treatment of customers that are interested, starting with even the fact that even those 8 models that were available at that time, often difficult to find at the dealerships, even those the ones that are technically available in our market. And then the dealerships themselves, low inventories, and often poorly informed sales staff. And this isn't unique to Ohio. We see this often in terms of dealerships around the country. And then, of course, as we've talked about, inadequate charging infrastructure. We need to see charging infrastructure public, workplace, and residential, including multi-unit residential. So some of the additional barriers, we've talked about limited utility support up until now. There's no EV programs that the utilities are operating in Ohio. And also, we need to see a lot more on the policy front. I hope we'll have an opportunity to talk about that in the next panel also. And then a lack of incentives. We've talked about that. There's no customer vehicle incentives currently in Ohio. And there's only a very small charging incentive operating right now by the Smart Columbus program. And then as I mentioned, we've seen slow policy adoption, particularly on the local side. And these are things, building codes have been mentioned, permitting processes, parking regulations. Those are the kinds of things I'm talking about in terms of local policy. So, but I think there's a lot in the offing that suggests that 2018 and beyond will be a real year of change in Ohio, real year of accelerated adoption. So first of all, we're just seeing, as has been mentioned, we're seeing a lot more models in the market. This is a partial list probably. I don't think I was able to get them all, but at least most of the models that are available in Ohio. The asterisks refer to, I don't believe that they're technically being sold in Ohio, but it's still fairly easy to obtain these vehicles through dealer connections and bringing vehicles in from out of state. So a lot more models means a lot more consumer choice here. And then one thing that I really want to emphasize is the growing used electric vehicle market. So we're now a full 7 years in to national markets and vehicle availability for plug-in electric vehicles. because the Chevy Volt and the Nissan Leaf, the first model years for those were 2011. And as we see more years go by, what we're noticing, because of the pace of the technology change, those owning electric vehicles often are interested in upgrading to the next model, buying something newer, and again, a lot of this is driven by the pace of change in the technology. So we see a higher number of vehicles moving into the used market, and we also see that these available used vehicles are available at prices that are at or below comparable models for internal combustion vehicles of the same type of model, mileage, and age of those vehicles. And so this is great news for a lot of people. In fact, most people buy used vehicles and not new ones. And this is great news for low and moderate income people for whom an electric vehicle is more accessible because of this growing used market. And we're also seeing a lot of progress in terms of consumer education. We need to see a lot more, as Katherine's mentioned, and then in terms of dealer engagement, again, need to see more, but we are starting. I think a lot of people have heard about Smart Columbus, a lot of work being done on consumer education and dealer engagement locally in Central Ohio. And it has been mentioned through our Drive Electric Ohio program. We're doing that work here locally. We're also doing it in 6 other locations around the state, building grassroots local organizations to do education and advocacy work around the state around electric vehicle adoption. So just lastly, I wanted to look a little more carefully at Ohio EV infrastructure, especially the public infrastructure. We need to see public, as I mentioned. We also need to see workplace infrastructure. As mentioned, the best practices show that is absolutely utilized and can be a key towards, once it's available, people begin to adopt at a much higher rate than if it were not available at the workplace. And then also multi-unit residential. But in terms of public, it's not able to be detailed enough to see exactly where these locations are, but these are locations based upon the PlugShare app that any electric vehicle that has a fast charging port, that any of them can use. But what you'll notice there is there's almost a total lack, really there is a total lack of corridor locations between cities in Ohio. And that's a real market barrier. So we're not seeing, and it's because of a market failure. We could talk about why this is the case. But this is an obvious example of where we need to see additional infrastructure deployed. This is also a snapshot of the entire state, but it's showing the infrastructure that's available to Tesla owners only. Tesla is one auto manufacturer that has really made a strong commitment to getting infrastructure out there. And so there are locations along interstate corridors for Tesla, but probably still not adequate at this point. But at least there are some locations, but only the Tesla owners can use these locations. But I did want to drill down a little bit more, just look more carefully at the Columbus area in terms of the deployment of DC fast charging. So when you look at the map and you see all the icons on the map, you think, oh, okay, that's pretty decent coverage, a decent number of stations. But then when you look more carefully, these locations they're often not strong locations. Sometimes they are, but sometimes they're not strong locations, mainly having to do with a lack of consumer amenities and just people, places where people want to spend time. So the example, there's many examples here, but the one that I always like to point to is at the Ohio State University Center for Automotive Research on Kahina Road. It's great that OSU Car has made this investment. It's a good station. It works. It's good to have it there. You see people using it. However, less than a quarter mile across the railroad tracks is Lenox Shopping Center. That would be a great location because there's things that people can do, shopping at Target, going to the movies, or whatever. And so that's just something that we need, as an example of something we need to see. We need to see strong locations, convenient, accessible, in places where people want to spend time. Also, these locations, they are all low-power DC fast charging. So the maximum rate of charge for these locations is 50 kilowatts per hour. That is not going to be adequate. And then finally, there are a number of location gaps that you can see there. Maybe the most glaring would be the downtown, the urban core there is completely unserved by locations right now. So just a brief mention of recommendations. First of all, we fully support, I think all the speakers on the program are going to feel the same way, that is it appropriate? It is appropriate and necessary to see utility investments in charging infrastructure. And I hope we get a chance to talk more about this, that good program design is necessary to ensure that all utility customers will benefit. This can happen. It just requires good program design and good policy. And we also need to see more in terms of EV-oriented policies. And I'd lift up dealing with the issue of demand charges, which presents a market barrier for DC fast charging, variable rate structures for electric vehicles, an ability for the utility to control the time of charge has also been talked about, and also an ability for site hosts to charge electricity, to charge the customers that they have for the electricity that's being dispensed, as you will. There's a lack of clarity in policy around that right now. And then EVs can be able to facilitate efficient utilization of grid assets. That's been talked about, and again, there's ways of going about that successfully. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Sam. Dan?
Good morning. There we go. Good morning. Chairman, Commissioners, thanks for the invitation to share with you some perspectives on EV market from AEP. I've appreciated hearing Commissioner Jones and panelists' comments and look forward to our dialogue. So first, looking at the opportunity, I know there's been some projections discussed. This is really a compendium of estimates on EV adoption forecast from a variety of sources, and while the forecasted adoption rates are important, I'd like to focus on a different trend. What it may be hard to see, the bottom line on that chart is EIA's forecast from 2015. The line above it is EIA's forecast from 2016, roughly doubling their 2015 projection. The line above that doubles that projection just a year later. In fact, the current EIA forecast is 10 times the forecast they made in 2014. So that's not unique to the forecasters, right? Bloomberg reported that IEA doubled their EV forecast this year. BP and ExxonMobil increased their forecast 40 and 50% just this year, and OPEC quintupled their estimate. So I'm not a forecaster myself, but I can spot a trend. So how many of these EVs are in Ohio? Most recent approximation is about 9,000. The wedges there represent the PHEV and EV projections, and the dotted line is estimates of actual vehicles on the road, mainly imports of used vehicles. How many EVs are in AEP Ohio service territory? Roughly a little over a third of those in Ohio. Growth continues, and the rate of growth continues as well. Where are the EVs in AEP Ohio service territory? As you would expect, major metro market in Columbus. However, there is a concentration in Athens, of course, home to Ohio University. And looking a little closer at Central Ohio, you can see the adoption rate is mainly in the northern parts of the city as well as surrounding suburbs. And while there appears to be a heavy concentration in Hilliard, that's the dark red area, 43026 zip code, On inspection, there's really a lease holding company that might have skewed that slightly at just this point in time estimate. But generally speaking, again, the concentrations are in the northern parts of the city. So where are all the EVs? Mainly, as discussed, they're parked. It's estimated that EVs are parked about all cars are parked about 95% of the time and thus available for charging. Where are they parked? Mostly at home, and then workplace and school. This study is conducted by Idaho National Labs, and it really examined the charging behavior by a fairly large sample of EV drivers that have access to charging at their workplace. As I said, the majority of charging happens at home, and then the next largest is at work, and only a relatively small percentage is actually done outside of these locations. The bottom chart to demonstrate on non-work days where the charging occurs, again, it's mainly at home. Now this slide was borrowed from Consumers Energy. They had presented at a Michigan Public Service Commission technical conference on the role of utilities in the EV marketplace. It provides, I think, a good illustration of the potential burden and benefit of EV charging at residences. And I didn't mean that term to be that negative, didn't mean that term burden to be negative. Really, it's just exemplifies the unmanaged charging scenario and the challenges that utilities will have under that scenario. Essentially, most commuters, when they arrive, most EV commuters, when they arrive home at night, simply plug in, and that will essentially add to evening peak loads. And you know, if you contrast that scenario on the left with the scenario on the right, which is a managed charging scenario, it really shows the benefits of not only shifting that load off peak, but also increasing load in the off-peak periods that allows for higher utilization of the existing fixed grid asset. So this illustrative example that I mentioned really does play out in the real world. At AEP, we've conducted an R&D program with a limited number of AEP employees that drive EVs. And these two charts are from AEP Ohio's It's Your Power app. That's an app that allows you to query your usage on not only energy consumption, but on a demand basis on an interval level. Both of these charts are from the same R&D participants' residence on comparable weather days in September at about the same evening peak. The one on the left shows evening peak demands without charging. They hit about a 5.5 kW peak. The one on the right shows unmanaged charging exceeding 10 kW. I should point out that the scale on this circle only goes to about 8. So unmanaged charging literally goes off the charts. So the net effect is that unmanaged charging effectively doubles the evening peak for our residential customers. So how much of this EV impact could we see? This is admittedly a simplified example of the relative energy impacts and demand impacts of charging at night at a residence. You know, the usage amount certainly can be substantial, as you would expect, as you shift your energy consumption from gasoline to electricity to power your transportation needs. But the bigger issue is demand. Adding a newer BEV charging at about a 7.7 kW rate could add the equivalent of an average-sized residence onto the existing residential customer's home demand. Adding a Tesla Model X that are available with dual 10 kW chargers could add the equivalent of 4 average-sized residences. So, and this is only considering one EV behind that transformer. Anecdotally, one of our R&D participants has 3 electric vehicles. He also has 3 electric vehicle charging stations in his garage. And then further, the trend obviously is toward more battery electric vehicles. It's toward faster charge rates, and we certainly will see a clustering effect as EVs get adopted. So this really exemplifies that utilities need to be involved, and regardless of what we want, we will be involved. And it really is up to us to determine sort of how we want to be involved and how we want to manage this load. So can we manage this load? We certainly can. with the right tools and the right engagement of the customer. These charts here are from California filing utilities analyzing their TOU rates and the ability to move that load off peak. And as you can see, the TOU rates that they implemented were very effective, moving up to 80% or almost 90% of their load off peak from the EV itself. It is important to note that the differential between on-peak and off-peak has to be sufficient to motivate that. In this case, it was about 1.8 to 2.1 times. And it's also important to note that this rate option applied to the EV itself only, not a whole house TOU rate. We found in past programs it's difficult to get a customer to move their entire rate, or entire home, to a TOU rate. But as was discussed in the panelists earlier, that customers are generally very amenable to moving their electric charging to any time, as long as the car is charged up in time for them to utilize it. So unfortunately, I don't believe there are any CREST providers in Ohio that offer TOU rates, and we serve Texas retail operations as well. And I don't believe any of them offer TOU rates. AEP Ohio currently does offer a TOU rate, a standard TOU whole house, as well as a seasonal TOU rate. But I think that's an issue that we'll have to look at, because I don't think the differential certainly is there, as you see in the California example here. I would say, though, that that's not the only mechanism, right? TOU rates are one mechanism to move that charge off peak. Other possibilities could be, DSM programs, load management programs, peak demand programs, demand rates, critical peak pricing. All of those types of mechanisms can be effective tools to incentivize that kind of behavior. But of course, every one of those comes with the attendant discussion in terms of what the impacts are, what the adoption rates will be, and so forth. So the next few slides really just look at sort of the opportunities and challenges of the EV space, and from a policy perspective at AEP. I'm going to very just briefly touch on the topics, and that is, we stepped back and looked at this and said, there are environmental benefits to EV adoption for society broadly. And they do present new load growth opportunities and grid management needs, as well as customer engagement opportunities for utilities. And that utilities can really jumpstart and support the market using their unique role as directed by the policymakers and regulators. And lastly, utilities are sort of uniquely positioned to optimize the fixed grid assets to accommodate that growth of EVs for the benefit of the EV infrastructure. As we look forward to what should be our focus in the future, we certainly want our customers to transition to EVs, to have a positive experience, and we want all customers to benefit from those changes. We believe we can continue to serve the public interest through being the enabler and optimizer of EVs onto the grid. And we believe that if managed appropriately, increased revenues can help offset the needs for rate increases. So as you are aware, the AEP Ohio is currently awaiting a ruling on a pending stipulation. I appreciate the sensitivity around that. This is mainly for the benefit of the audience. This just provides basically a summary of the stipulation specifics. About $9.8 million in rebates would be available for 300 level 2 EVSEs and 75 DC fast chargers. Public workplace and MDU locations, multiple dwelling unit locations, would all be eligible. Individual rebates would vary based upon the several criteria that are established in the stipulation, as well as 10% of those funds would be designated for low-income areas. Pending approval of the Commission, certainly we're looking forward to implementing this program to help support adoption of electric vehicle and electric vehicle service equipment in Ohio. What else has AEP Ohio done in this area to help support the development of the EV marketplace? There was a study conducted by EPRI that models the economic and grid impacts of adoption of EVs in our service territory. It was essentially a cost-benefit study that analyzed both the ratepayer impact as well as the impact on a broader regional perspective. The results of that, the high EV adoption case, was that there was a regional benefit of $1,595 for every vehicle that was deployed in the AEP service territory. That's the numbers that's depicted here. There's also a ratepayer net impact of $1,470 per vehicle. As importantly, though, it also indicated that managed charging boosts the net benefits both on a ratepayer basis as well as a regional basis. So again, that study I imagine you're aware of as well. I won't go into a lot of the detail. The other study that EPRI Ohio has participated in is an NREL study that was conducted to provide guidance on EV infrastructure to ensure the effectiveness of public-private investments. The study was conducted, as I said, with NREL along with the U.S. DOE's Vehicle Technology Office. It was supported by the City of Columbus, Ohio State University, Clean Fuels Ohio, Mid-Ohio Region Planning Commission, as well as AEP. And NREL used their EV Pro model to generate scenarios of regional charging needed to support their goal of vehicle adoption. The results indicated that about 400 level 2 chargers at multi-dwelling units and 350 level 2 chargers at non-residential locations were required to support Columbus's goal of 5,300 EVs by the year 2020. The report also concluded that consumer demand for DC fast chargers will remain low. However, a minimum level of coverage was really required to help ease consumer range anxiety. These example maps that are depicted here were really included in the report as an illustration more so on where generally where L2 and DC infrastructure was needed. But per the pending stipulation, AEP Ohio will coordinate specific locations and construction arrangements with the stakeholders to the project. A word on public charging. EPRI performed an analysis of prices at public EVSEs using data from PlugShare. PlugShare is the leading crowdsourced provider of publicly available EVSEs in the market. It is important to acknowledge that only about a fourth of the infrastructure in PlugShare, the charging stations in PlugShare actually have a price, and many stations are provided to drivers for free through their site hosts. But it's noteworthy that prices can reach 40 cents a kilowatt hour, or roughly the equivalent of $4 a gallon gas. The equivalent, let's say home charging, might be 12 cents or $1.20 a gallon. So that's an important component to recognize, is that eventually, I think as you look forward in terms of adoption or where that charging is going to occur, it's going to occur at home, not only because it's convenient because it's less expensive, and it'll occur at workplace because it's convenient and oftentimes offered for free. Other public infrastructure is challenged, as we said, in terms of the business model. This chart simply depicts some various public policy options being considered around utility infrastructure investment. I think it's important, and I know we've had this discussion in Ohio, and we continue to have it in the jurisdictions around AEP service territory. And as Commissioner Jones mentioned, it can be a sort of a loaded discussion. However, I would point out that the model can be applied differently based upon the different types of charging. So you could apply one of these models for residential charging, you apply another model for DC fast charging, still yet another model for public charging. And specifically with regarding DC fast charging, as was mentioned earlier, DC fast charging is, again, very challenged from a financial standpoint. They're likely going to be sited along highway corridors. It can be challenging to find site hosts. And it really is probably a good opportunity for public funding support, whether that's through VW money or what have you. Lastly, I'll just simply leave you with this slide, and this is essentially some research we conducted with our own customers. because at the end of the day, we can't lose sight of what potential EV drivers want. Our customers have clearly told us they want information on EVs and EVSEs from the utility. Some of the most important issues to them involve cost of charging both home and away, special rate availability, and how much they could save with EVs. So we believe that customers will look to us as sort of a trusted source of information, and we certainly want to fulfill that obligation and meet the needs of our customers. Thank you very much.
Dan, thank you. Wonderful panel. And I suspect that we will have a lot of questions if the body doesn't mind, if I can start. Oh, yeah. Sorry. For the audience, we do have cards if you wanted to write down a question. We will have some of our commission aides that are in the audience grab those questions and push them up to me for review. We had 3 questions yesterday. Two of which were asked and answered, and one of which I just filtered out. So, so that is not to mean that your question will surely be asked if you write it down. However, we did want to provide that. Provide that opportunity. Okay, so let me just attack this from a broader policy perspective, but it will yield then questions that I think I'd love to get the panel's opinion on. So, look, I think the panel has made the case for there to be action in this space. The supply of electric vehicles that will be coming online. I mean, it almost, Britta, Dan, I mean, your presentations, it almost felt like a bit of a crisis when I was listening to those presentations, where I thought to myself, oh my gosh, or, if you were going to be churning out these automobiles, is the infrastructure out there and ready? And I have no doubt that through some of your initiatives, you're working behind the scenes to try and ensure that that's the case. But I want to focus on our role in particular with EV infrastructure. So, first question, what is the PUCO's role in making sure that the infrastructure is built out in an intelligible and purposeful manner, okay? And so what I mean by that is, it sounds like there are other cooks in the kitchen here. You cited a couple entities that have provided some grant opportunities. Katherine, you come from an entity that is, very much focused on ensuring that this infrastructure proliferates. And so what is, if is it the commission's role to say, well, we think it makes sense that there are charging stations across Interstate 70 and up and down 71, or is that someone else's job? And how deep do we need to be in the throes of that sort of infrastructure planning? So that's the first question. If anyone would like to.
I'll start that one off. Yeah, I would, much like what's happening in Michigan right now, I would love to see the Public Service Commission here act as really a convener of stakeholders, many here, many in the audience, to put together just the big plan. What's the right role for utilities? What are the guiding principles for what should happen? What are the buckets of infrastructure needed? And let's weigh in and just figure out what's the most cost-effective, fair way to lay out early infrastructure and build a basis upon which the competitive market can then come in at some point and really join and build upon that base.
Yeah, I mean, I think a challenge is, and this will be a challenge for any state commission, not just ours. I think a challenge is that, look, our purview is over distribution utilities and rate making and rate design, and what do we approve expenditures for, and so that this dynamic creates. This dynamic creates, potentially an expanded, a potentially expanded role there with respect to not there's that particular purview, but there's also just if we're going to do this right for Ohio, we want to make sure that we're not doing it in a manner that is duplicative of what other entities are doing. That is cost effective based upon the area. And so, and any other comments on this particular just conundrum?
I have a couple, but why don't, I see Dan wants to speak. Catherine, do you want to speak on that too?
I'd just quickly say, I think that obviously, as I discussed, EV charging infrastructure is going to impact the utilities, and therefore it's going to impact the commission in terms of smart use of the infrastructure. So I think if we're looking at just the basic functionality of sort of what the utility role will be, what the commission's oversight role will be, should be around, how do we effectively utilize the infrastructure we have so we don't create additional peaks, so we don't create additional costs unnecessarily. And at the same time, how do we shift that load to the degree we can to off-peak so we can make better utilization of the existing assets, right? Utilities are facing decreased revenues from a lot of different sources. Increased revenues would be welcome if it's not commensurate with additional cost increases needed to meet that load.
Mr. Chairman, if I could, just let me offer 3 areas. I think I covered these in my remarks a bit, but I think it's planning, policy guidance, and then utility filings. Those are your 3 areas. In planning, I would suggest, because as you say, you have state DOT, like a city Department of Transportation here in Columbus. So you have the transportation planning issues. That's not your job, primarily. But you have to be in that discussion, because if they start talking about DC fast charging and level 2 publics and you're not in the discussion, it doesn't serve AEP's interests. The more important thing, as Dan just said, is I know IRPs are not done here, like in other states, but something like a 5, 10, 15-year look, if you can do this, because the average life of a vehicle is what, Britta, 11 years?
14 years.
14 years
max.
So just take your planning horizon out to 14 years and do a kind of a 14-year plan and tie it into the grid management and utilization. So the planning is transportation, distribution grid. Policy guidance. Now the UTC, where I was a commissioner, we issued a policy statement. Kind of the legislature told us to do it, but we also thought the 3 commissioners thought it was a good thing to do. So that's your call. In Michigan, Chair Talberg has decided with Commissioner Sari and Commissioner Eubanks not to issue policy guidance, but they've used orders. So they've had some workshops, and then after the workshops, they've issued an order that has quite a bit of policy guidance in it. Then there's another workshop. So that's something you can do. And of course, the last thing is a utility filing. And I'm not going to comment, obviously.
Sure.
It would be ex parte on the current filing, but hopefully other filings from the utilities come in and you adjudicate.
But you can understand the concern, right? Because even if the group up here is convinced that we should do something, we should take action, we'll issue some policy guidance. Not saying that this body would feel this way, but there will be potentially, there are a number of stakeholders in this state, right? There will be some stakeholders that express concern that the utility is just trying to pad its financial interests by pushing out EV charging stations here, there, everywhere, and we won't have a true sort of roadmap, no pun intended. I mean, we won't have a true, if we do it that way, there'll just be piecemeal applications that come in, and we won't have sort of a true overall kind of state strategy or roadmap associated with the deployment. And so I'm just trying to balance what is undoubtedly a case that's been made that we should do something, but also the naysayer perspective as well, which I think is a fair perspective. I mean, I don't think that we wouldn't want anybody to take action on anything this big without a true game plan. Sam?
I just like to add just one comment on that in terms of the role. I think one of the other roles which begins to get at that is policy. And so we've talked about demand charges as being a market barrier in terms of DC fast charging. That's an example. You know, various utilities handle those issues in various ways, but but some recognition and in convening on the part of the commission, moving towards some kind of action that works to get at some of these market barriers that are more policy oriented. Being able to have policy which enables the utilities to control when the charging is occurring, as long as the charging is, the vehicles are fully charged by the time the consumer needs them. There's a policy issue embedded in that. I think at a higher level is just to begin with a recognition that this is an appropriate role for utilities to play. It requires some planning. There's a market-based approach here, which we need to be moving towards. And so I think part of the role for the commission is to convene and to continue to move forward with all the stakeholders.
Okay. Very good. Another policy perspective. So outside of just doing this for the benefit of Ohio, and all of the benefits that you guys described for the benefit of Ohio, economic development, environmental, all of these things. There's also the, from the PUC's perspective, the concern about just distribution grid functioning with all of these EV charging stations that could potentially be deployed. Dan, the perspective that you gave is it'll be fine. Dan Bowermaster, Dan Francis, you've got a couple slides in here that talk about some of the work that you'd have to do on the D system in order to make sure that you're accommodating all of this. If one of the principles that comes out of grid mod is that, of course, reliable power must continue to be delivered to customers. That we widely see as the utility's responsibility. I'm assuming the panel widely sees that as the utility's responsibility to make sure that the system continues to function appropriately, is balanced, etc. Right? Everybody head nods, okay.
The answer is yes.
Yep, okay. Last is the concept of utilizing the charging station as a resource. So we had, I think it was Dan Bowermaster discussed some of the potential uses of the EV charging stations. Can be used as, if you used for demand response, used as storage. As we start dipping our toe into the rate-making, rate design elements of this, and we will dip our toe into it in the AEP case that I won't get into. As we start dipping our toe into this, any broader policy thoughts for the commission with respect to sort of packaging some of this up to create benefit for the customers that have EVs, or just bill payers broadly? I mean, have there been programs in particular that you have felt like have really worked to the benefit of customers in being able to package some of this stuff up, possibly through use in wholesale markets? Just looking for any thoughts there.
Well, I'll start with that one. A couple of challenges, Mr. Chairman, is these programs are relatively new, so historical data is lacking. So I would be the first to admit that. So we need more data. That's why we need more pilots, we believe, is to generate, whether it's level 2 public or level 2 workplace, to see how this is being used. Now, some data is coming in, and that's good. So that's point number one. Point number two, there are some jurisdictions such as Oregon, Portland General, Southern California Edison, even Con Ed in New York, that are approving what they call economic development tariffs. So you may not like the word economic development, Mr. Chairman, because you're an economic regulator. But the idea is for demand charges, because about every conference you go to in EVs, people, and you'll hear from the panel this afternoon, the EV ecosystem really dislikes utility demand charges. But the utility pushes back and says, hey, we need to have full cost recovery for a heavy load, a unique load in our system. So we need we need demand charges. So those three utilities, and we could provide these for the record if you wish, but it's basically a holiday of a demand charge for 7 to 10 years. So you phase down the demand charge to zero, increase volumetric, and that's a way perhaps of getting more of these DC fast chargers into the portfolio of the distribution grid. So that's one example of what you could consider. There are some other considerations too. I don't know if Dan wants to talk about any other options given the sensitivity of the current case. But
Yeah, you certainly won't touch on any of that. I guess the way I think about that is similar to the previous conversation on what's the role. So what's the role of the utilities? What's the role of the market players? If we recognize that it needs to be managed, who's responsible for that? Certainly, we're responsible as a utility, responsible for the reliability and resiliency of the grid. But if we don't have programs to impact that, we're not optimizing, right? So we're not ending up in a position where we're optimizing the use of the grid and probably not what you would expect of us. So the utility certainly has a role in that respect, but you could say, well, that's not the utility's role. It's a third-party marketer role. But I don't know where their motivation is, because I'm not sure exactly how they assemble the benefits to accomplish that as well. So I think very fundamentally we have to decide what's the utility role in that. If it's a management then of that infrastructure, then and knowing what we know about EV charging and what it might entail, sort of what role do we want the utility to do, and what tools will we give the utility to accomplish that? So on a broad basis.
If I could just add maybe a small sort of perspective from the automakers. Back in the 2010, 11, 12, right when the Volt came into the market, we began to really focus on technology demonstrations and pilots with utilities. We did a number, maybe 5 or 6 technology demonstrations to methodically go through sort of the building blocks of what it would take to get to demand response, bring wind onto, connect wind signals to OnStar, send a signal down to Volts that are plugged into Google's parking lot. We did a number of these things. So we checked off in that time period that everything's possible. We could send telemetric signals from utility to automaker to, OnStar, in other words, again, down to the vehicles, and start demonstrating all of this stuff. As we speak, and at the time, we were thinking about, let's just get ready for when in case this really scales fast. Because we agree there's a huge opportunity for using EVs as assets on the grid and performing real functions and perhaps even revenue producing functionality for the consumer or the utility. Anything that we can do to make this package more attractive for consumers is really interesting for us, and be able to talk a story about how good this is for the grid. We're moving energy problems and actually solving them with a better energy solution using electricity. As we speak, we've begun to, we are now productionizing this smart grid API that we have at OnStar, preparing it this year to offer it to utilities around the country. Anyone who can now interface and create their own API to connect with OnStar. And this is just one pathway to do it through our telemetrics. You can do it with the charge station. You can do it at home through your AMI, perhaps. Many ways to do this. But the point is that we're productionizing it because we began to feel that we're hearing a lot of comments from commissions talking about how you still got to prove more that every vehicle is doing something for the grid. This is good for every ratepayer. And rather than wait for when scale shows up and we really want to do it, we've just decided we want to make this capability available now, so that every utility could have the ability then to tap into at least all of our vehicles, electric vehicles, and work this relationship with the consumers and offer these programs that move folks off of peak, move wind, move solar into the vehicles and so on. So I just want to sort of tell you that we are moving this forward because we understand the questions you will receive about, is every vehicle now hurting or helping? And it can help, and we're now going to change that to, yeah, it is helping today.
Yeah, very good. And this is really just commentary, really, for our utility community, which is, if in the event that you're able to sort of monetize some of the collective benefit from these EV charging stations, a better governmental / societal business case can be made if every customer is receiving a benefit from what you're able to monetize from the EV charging stations. If you are able to afford an electric car as well as a charging station, and then you also are the only recipient of the benefit of, aggregating all of the EV, aggregating all of the EV and utilizing it in a wholesale market for demand response or other, that's a really tough pill to swallow for government, just broadly. So just something to think about as you're sort of designing programs going forward with EVs. So let me, I've got more, but let me cede my time here because I want to make sure I get everybody's questions answered up here. Beth?
Thanks. Great panel. Great panelists. Thank you. I have a teenager that's going to be driving soon, and so my husband and I are considering an EV. So, among other things, I kind of like the notion of range anxiety. I think that actually is appealing as a parent to keep them closer to home. Yeah, but the other piece is we had Honda in here during phase 2, and they talked about this app where you plug in your car, and this app, kind of charges it when is most beneficial to the grid, most least cost at the time. And I didn't know if GM and others are also pursuing this, because I can see, again, as a teenager, comes home 3 or 4 o'clock, plugs in the car, worst time to be doing that. But if you have an app that kind of mitigates that cost factor or controls when that car will be charging, that's the most beneficial to the grid and our pocketbook, I was wondering if anybody could talk about that.
And I can, and that's exactly what I was saying before. The path to this is us productionizing our API at OnStar so that utilities create the app with the customer that then also they create their API to talk to OnStar in our case. So that's exactly what you have to do. We've already done these, like I said, in these pilot projects back in the 2011-12 time period, where we've actually walked through all of those building blocks, we've done all those things. Now it's time to make it commercially ready. And so that's exactly what I was talking about. Make it very seamless for the customer. And by the way, when we first started the Volt back in 2007, the very first partnership we created was with EPRI and about 100 of their utility members, including AEP and First Energy. And one of the things we did in that partnership, what was I going to say? Oh, I've lost my complete train of thought. Darn it. I've completely lost my train of thought. I'm sorry.
Okay.
I'll mention just quickly.
Okay.
So most manufacturers, most EV manufacturers have that capability. I have that in my car.
Oh,
okay.
Currently,
What we can do with the
but we need to motivate a customer to do it. One thing is that we have to just, one, educate them that they can do it, and 2, we have to motivate them to do it. And if there's no incentive for them to do it, then they largely aren't going to do it, and that's the challenge.
Okay. I see what you're saying.
I recalled my thought. It was that when we first set up the relationship with about 100 very forward-leaning utilities in the country, we laid out different work streams. And within 1 year, we had a policy work stream on how do these two industries work together, what would be our policy priorities, can we agree on how we, what's important to us. We laid out a work stream on communication talking points. Can we agree on the language, what's a BEV, what's a PHEV, can we just agree and write talking points and Q&A on how to do this. The third pathway was, our work stream was on technology on the vehicle. And this was a real education for me and others at GM as we listened and tried to understand What happens when these vehicles get at any scale on the grid? What happens to the grid? Where are the pain points? What do you want the vehicle to be able to do? And that first generation Volt back in 2010 of December of 2010, that first generation Volt already has all the capability, all the programmability it will ever need to design rate information getting sent up to the vehicle and down to the phone app that the customer uses, time of day selection, 7 days a week. It modeled the 4 seasons, it modeled peak, it modeled the worst case, which was California's crazy 4-tier system of rates, and all that stuff is programmed even in the first generation vehicle where we never used it except for the 5 or 6 demonstrations we did. But that is already in the vehicle. So we have been, our industry has been preparing this for scale ever since, at least in our case, since the very first generation vehicle.
Another question, just one more. Consumer education. So during the electric restructuring legislation that was passed in Ohio back in 1999, there was legislative language put in for the commission to educate customers on retail choice. Now, I guess we've kind of learned a lot through that process over the years, what worked, what didn't. And I guess I'm kind of curious as to what is the commission's role? I heard education and awareness being really key to this process. Is that something that you view as a role for the commission, or is that just a role that each of you play in various ways? I guess if anybody could talk a little bit more about that.
I know Sam wants to speak to that, but just let me mention nationally a couple of stipulations that have come out in the past 3 months in Oregon. There is funding, not for the commission, but there's funding for the utility to engage in outreach and education efforts. It's, I think for Portland General's case, it's like $800,000-900,000, and similar for Pacific Power. No money for the commission, but, and part of that is, as Katherine talked about too, there's money in there for auto dealer education as well. So there are some examples in recent stipulations, commission orders where this is the case, but not for commissions. Sam?
Yeah, just to build on that, I think the role of the commission here is to provide a framework for utilities to incorporate the dollars needed for those kind of programs into their filings, and ultimately into the programs that would be approved by the commission, and then to have a combination of utility itself doing some education, but also outsourcing a good bit of that to third parties in order to broaden out the base of how that education is occurring. I mean, there's various organizations that have different kinds of expertise to do different kinds of education, ride drive events, those types of things that are very important. And then there's also some higher level education that's also important. It's a critical element of this. I think Electrify America just did a study. They were looking at brand recognition on the part of consumers for different types of electric vehicle brands, and less than 50% of consumers nationally even recognize what these EV brands even are, where a sort of a typical expectation would be about 90% recognition. What is a Honda Civic? What is a Toyota Camry? Those kind of brand, the consumer recognizes and knows what those brands are, but the same is not the case with these EV brands at this point. So it needs to occur top to bottom.
Great, thank you so much.
Tom?
Great panel. Thank you very much. I just want to go back and, just to, and I don't know, Phil, if you're the person to answer this or not, but, as we talk to people, as we think about this, some people say, why should you allow utilities to recover costs for an EV charging station when, really, I think this is an oversimplification, but, they talk about, look, this isn't low income, they're going to have to pay for this, even middle class people, certain areas of the state, it's almost impossible for them to use this type of you know, to use an electric car at this time. So what do you say about that?
Well, I heard my name mentioned. Unless somebody wants to go first, I'll go first.
I say that because you've been in this position.
Yeah. Number one, I think somehow you need to find a way to put your policy hat on those big factors that we mentioned. Technology, innovation, the economic development, the greenhouse gas reductions, and I know you're not a leader in all of those, but you need to kind of land on some policy framework first because this is a big issue and it's kind of medium to long term. Secondly, the distribution grid is going to be affected by EV penetrations, whether it's DC fast, especially with DC fast charging, right? And even level 2, according to Dan's chart, I mean, you're talking about loads of 4, 7 kilowatts, maybe with a Tesla Model 3 getting up to 20. Now, you're right, the low-income people are not going to drive Teslas, most likely, even with the Model 3. But there are a lot of other makers out there that are coming out with affordably priced EVs that could be driven not just in Columbus and Cincinnati, but in rural Ohio. So the issue is, to me, it's more the planning for this with your fellow state agencies and the cities, and then the distribution grid impacts that Dan talked about. The worst thing that you want is having these people buying EVs and coming home and charging from 4 to 6 p.m. because that adds load, that aggravates coincident peaks. So as commissioners, you don't want that. So even though you don't have an IRP process and a planning process, you need to come up with some way of working with the stakeholders to kind of plan that out. So that would be my answer in terms of low income and disadvantaged, you know, with the principles that we use in NARUC and Bond-Bright's principles over the years, the regulatory paradigm, you have the ability to, I'm not going to use the word socialize, but spread those costs out as you see fit in the public interest. You determine what the public interest is. So once you get past that policy hurdle, you need to get to the rate design issues if you're going to do this. So for example, with low income and disadvantaged communities, you can do certain things. For multi-unit dwelling, remember the debates we used to have over energy efficiency measures, going from incandescent bulbs to CFLs and then LEDs. The landlord had no incentive. That's called the split incentive. No incentive to install those for the tenants, but we decided, many commissions decided that it was in the public interest to do that. So there are a number of tools that you have, I think, in the regulatory toolbox, Commissioner, that you could deal with that. But you're right, it's kind of a tough policy call at the start.
And could I add 2 things to that? One is that consumers living in disadvantaged and low-income communities suffer more from poor air quality than consumers in other higher-end communities. So that's number 1. Number 2 is that you can go buy a used Nissan Leaf, 2 years off a lease, and I've heard of prices as low as $6,000, $7,000. If you combine that price for a 2-year-old vehicle with the low fuel costs from your local utility, that is an equation for low-income and disadvantaged communities. And so we are looking at that market as extremely key, and that becomes part of the narrative for the win-win. These are fact-based measures that we have to include in the conversation.
And very low maintenance as well, right, Britta?
Yep. No oil,
No oil.
brake pads,
Right.
on and on it goes.
It's all systems.
And that kind of yields an interesting chicken or the egg kind of scenario for us as we evaluate this, which is if in fact there are going to be vehicles available that our low-income population would find to be affordable, does the infrastructure exist to where they're located and where they need to go to actually make it worth their while. Commissioner Friedman.
First of all, thank you. Thank you all. I have a laundry list of questions. I'm going to ask one, though. Don't panic. Don't panic. And actually, it's part commentary and a follow-up to both the chairman and Commissioner Johnson's questions, I think. As we take a look at the various issues that we're addressing in this exercise, obviously the cost implications are very important. EVs have cost implications relative to the cost of charging infrastructure, as well as the impacts on the distribution system. And then we have to prioritize, and then we have to figure out, I think, how to equitably allocate the costs associated with the activities. Having said that, we live in a state where there is electric retail competition. I think, Phil, there are probably 14 other states, yes, most of which are pretty populous, who can act, I think, maybe as non-traditional partners, natural allies in this exercise. So here's the question, Britta. I mean, you obviously represent the auto industry. A, have you approached these people? And B, do you think there are other non-utility allies out there that can help create a market and therefore defray the costs associated with the ratepayers?
And I'm sorry, you're talking about third-party providers of infrastructure? Is that what you're talking about?
I'm talking about commodity sales in the state of Ohio. And again,
You've asked a question, I think, that just went above my head.
okay.
I'm sorry.
No, that's okay.
No?
Do you let me ask it maybe a different way, and that is this: as you try to build this business, I mean, obviously you want to build a business. Are you looking at non-utility allies that can act as finance vehicles for the EV charging stations, for instance, that can provide low-cost electricity to lower the cost associated with the gas gallon equivalent? Has anyone explored others, or is there? Phil, I'll ask you. I'm sorry, Brett. I did not mean to put you on the spot. Phil, Phil, would you consider these as viable alternative market development participants?
The short answer is yes. And there is a lot of experimentation going on in that. And you're going to hear on the next panel after lunch from some of those people, ChargePoint, Green Lots, and there are others out there too that are dealing in this space. Now, these are contentious issues. Some of those providers like to work more with utilities. Some of the other providers don't like to work as much with utilities and believe that innovation comes from their sector and that the utility is not good at innovating. The position of my alliance is that's the wrong proposition, that we have this infrastructure gap, we need to get on with it. The pie is big enough that all can prosper. If these projections are true, there's going to be space for your competitive retail providers here in Ohio as well as AEP and First Energy. So that's my kind of big picture macro view. I can maybe offline or later tell you about some specific examples the Southern Company is doing in Atlanta, Avista is doing in my state. There are a lot of examples where utilities are trying to partner with either an NGO or a third-party provider to get services out to areas that are kind of tough to serve. So,
Thank you.
Go ahead. This is for Dan Francis, and I'm familiar with the AEP Ohio Grid Smart rollout, including the AMI, the It's Your Power app, which I think you had a screenshot in your presentation, and the Energy Bridge device. So I get that there's kind of an availability of time of use rates for residential customers that can kind of optimize the charging. For the public charging stations, is there data and information that's needed that doesn't exist in current technology, or are there challenges unique to those public charging stations compared to in-home charging?
I don't know if this answers the question precisely, but and let me know if it does not, but the issue primarily with the residential is that we have volumetric recovery, right? We don't have demand charges on residential customers. We also have them setting evening peaks, which are more, it's really a distribution, it's really that backyard transformer really that's most of the concern. Most of the commercial entities, workplace chargers, and I'll set aside for a moment the DC fast chargers, but most of the level 2 public chargers as well as workplace chargers are in facilities that are adequate to fulfill those demands, or they have management systems that will manage the demand of the chargers within that garage or lot. So it's less of concern from an operational perspective. And now the DC fast charger is another breed, obviously, and that talks, where you really have to talk about, where it might be most beneficial from a cost to serve standpoint of three-phase service or what have you. That conversation needs to occur on the siting, and I think all recognize that it should occur, and utilities are consulted in that regard. So I don't know if that answers your question or.
No, that's helpful. Thank you.
Well, Dan, I want to follow up there and see if I can sum up what we heard. In looking at the data presented today, the two takeaways that I have is that we have a sort of a problem with the current growth, or a potential future problem with the current growth, and then a problem with fast charging. Let's look at the current growth. The figures that everybody presented showed that this market has just been taking off and growing very healthily on its own. Everyone's showing a really big growth in adding EV vehicles, and that most of these are being supplied with level 1 and level 2 chargers at home. And it looks like the overall impact on the system isn't bad. Most of our utilities here now are in static or no growth positions, and we've seen periods of great growth before, but it looks like it's something that may be within the capital items that can be handled. The only problem that I heard with the current growth on people just using the car to drive to work and back and charging at home is that under our current rate design, where we only charge at residentials on a kilowatt hour basis, we may be setting up a problem if everyone comes home and charges at. It may add to the peak, so we need to spread that out. We may look to rate design. Let me stop there. Is that a fair estimate of where we are on the current EV growth?
Yeah, I think from a concern standpoint, you're right. It's as you described, it's the residential charging demand peak, and then the DC fast charge, which needs to be coordinated. I think those are the big issues from a utility standpoint that need addressed. So.
Okay. Well, in terms of the rate design and doing something about the peak, we're all ears. This is something that I think we'll continue to have dialogue on. Now let's move to the fast charge. The fast charge gets into the problems of the corridors because no one wants to spend 4 hours at the BP station recharging. And I guess the first problem, and we didn't talk about it here, but we might as well identify it now, is that for the fast charge, you have to have three-phase service?
Traditionally, yeah.
Yeah. And is there a problem in these corridors, like going up 71 or going up 75, getting three-phase service in?
It's not so much the location. Certainly there are areas that are going to be better situated for a DC fast charger, but it's not obviously the only consideration, the operational. It's also a driver wanting to have amenities or capabilities there. So there are a variety of different considerations that need to be factored in, as well as distance between chargers. So that's where you get into this optimization of where that location will be, where that should be sited. So it's not so much just an operational issue in terms of the utility impact, but also other considerations that factor into that as well.
So
and then also, I'll also add, the business model is very challenged. So they're fairly expensive. Chargers themselves, so they're fairly expensive to do the make-ready. They typically are utilized, at least in the early start of the market, the early portions of the market adoption. You'll see lots of intermittent load, so you'll have it used and it'll be drawing a lot of power. So it obviously talks about where it's hitting those demand peaks, but it's not utilized enough in the early portions of the adoption of EVs to where you have enough of that where you're recovering the revenue. So you hit that demand charge issue, which Britta talked about.
Okay. So just to funnel that one down, so we've got sort of two issues on the fast charge. One, we have location, and we have to consider where you needed to develop the transport corridor. And the second is going to be but not only a rate design, but probably maybe a cost support in order to get it started.
Exactly.
Anything else we need to think about on the fast charge?
that's the primary topics. I don't know, Dan Bowermaster, I know you deal with these issues as well.
Yeah,
Across
this is a
utilities.
great discussion. I mean, the DC fast charge, I mean, it's addressing that customer need, whether it's, a Maven car share or a bus or someone traveling to grandma and grandpa's house on the holidays. You need that charge now, so you have much less flexibility on load shift. I mean, there's different examples around the country. For example, Southern California Edison has just recently released, 2 or 3 different commercial rates that basically not tiered, divided into 5-year periods, where the first 5 years there might be a higher energy charge and a low or no demand charge, and then you can kind of imagine those two things kind of swap over time in 5 years. And the idea is to match utilization with, kind of the what the site host would have to pay for a rate.
Well, and I guess that was a point, I think, Phil, that you made earlier, that we're going to have to broaden our horizon then maybe and look longer in our planning, because we're looking at vehicles with 14-year lives.
Yeah,
I'm sorry, go ahead.
the other thing I'd say is, well, 2 things. There are some good examples, Portland General and some others. Once you get the electric buses into the transit agencies, and I think AEP and your utilities are probably talking to these folks, that's a pretty significant demand. It can get up to 800 kilowatts a megawatt 5. Depends on whether they continuously charge or overnight charge. So then you're faced with the issue of, do I do a separate tariff, like a totally separate tariff for that sort of charging for the transit agencies, all electric buses, or do I do it within my CNI, my existing schedules and existing rates? And the only other point, and Britta, you may want to talk about this too, it's not just the intercity corridor issue on 71 and 75 here in Ohio. It is if this ride sharing and mobility stuff really takes off, like with Maven. Britta talked about this. You are going to have concentrated shared riders and they're charging twice a day, and they aren't going to tolerate level 2 public. So they want DC fast charging. So again, that's a load you need to consider.
Yeah, I would just say, let's not overlook DC urban hubs where you might have a real kind of traditional gas station, or, like 10 pumps at a site all around the city, for jointly supporting fleets, possibly mass transit, ride sharing that Phil just mentioned, autonomous vehicles, which will certainly be in commercial applications like ride sharing, car sharing functions, but also this MDU problem with apartment and condo dwellers. To fix building codes and get level 1, level 2 into all these apartments and condominiums, in my mind, that's a 30, 40-year plan. What could be done today is to build these hubs and leverage them, bring apartment condo dwellers to the hubs and allow them a much faster solution. You put a couple stations in the urban area and you're supporting all of this advanced transportation and addressing near-term the MDU challenge that you can work on with building codes, over the next 30, 40 years.
So it's fair to say then, not only do we have the intercity corridors, we have intra-city corridors as well, where you're going to have the mass transit, or if it's like, the share cars that they're going to be going up and down.
Yep.
Okay, thank you.
Dan?
Just a quick comment. Actually, Howard asked better than I think I could have asked the questions that were on my mind. But it seems to me that one question that I'll need to resolve is, to what extent do we need to get involved with the DC fast charging deployment and support our utilities doing that? And if we are thinking about getting involved with it, how do we protect those who don't use or who don't have EVs from unfairly bearing the burden of those costs? And then conversely, to what extent is the new world of EVs, is it pretty well served with the build out that's going to occur more organically as a result of those who use and have the EVs, the level 1 and the residential level 2 chargers? How big of a problem is I know it's a problem, the DC fast charging to accomplish the goals that are out there, and but there's this tension with solving that, for me, there's a tension between the positive results of solving that goal and saying, well, the only game in town for really addressing that is the utilities and the regulators making it happen. And I just wonder how big of a problem it is and to what extent we can protect those who are going to be paying for it from unfairly bearing the burden of paying for it. That's a statement. You can react to it or
Sam?
think about it over.
I'll make a short statement, but Sam, go first. Dan, do you have anything on? No? Okay.
Well, I just think it's important to kind of back up and look at the big picture of, there's a tremendous opportunity for not only motorists owning electric vehicles, but all utility customers to reap financial benefits through lower rates as a result of this load growth. So, as we see this load growth, as long as there's nothing done to, as long as we're able to eliminate the market barriers to the growth of electric vehicle adoption, as we see this load growth, that's up to how the programs are designed and then ultimately, how that revenue is shared. But there's going to be revenue in excess of the cost. And then it's just a matter of how that gets driven down to benefit all ratepayers. But fundamentally, in order for that to happen, we need to see the load growth occur. We need to remove market barriers, whether that's market, the number one market barrier is lack of adequate charging infrastructure, and that includes multi-unit residential, includes workplace, and it also includes retail, especially DC fast charging, but also level 2 fast charging. That's the number one market barrier, and consumer education is also a market barrier. So we have to remove those market barriers, and the most, certainly, we believe, and I think the data, if you look around the country and where we've seen success, bears this out, that utilities have an essential role to play. Yes, there's other actors that can enter into this. We see the Ohio EPA with the Electrify America, with the VW settlement, the Electrify America. Those are short-term, kind of one-off plays there. But the utilities have a fundamental role to play, and it's a role that centers in on investment in the charging infrastructure, done in a way from a program design and a policy standpoint that ensures that indeed, as this load builds, as this market builds, that all utility customers are going to reap benefits from that.
Commissioner, I know we're getting to lunchtime now, but just a quick add-on to that. You ask a very good question. In my 12 years being a commissioner, I spent endless hours reading testimony on rate spread and rate design, and whether parity, 1.0, 0.8, the different rate classes. So obviously, this is something that you're going to have to struggle with for the non-participant classes. I agree with Sam. There's not a lot of historical data yet. This is why it's a bit of a venture by you all. But I agree with Sam that over time, with DC fast charging, if the utility benefits from the increased revenue, and there could be substantial increased revenue, if these market projections take place, if electric buses come, if commercial fleets come, there's going to be increased revenue. So there is a possibility for downward pressure on rates over time, but that's going to be, for the non-participants, we face this with other emerging technologies like smart grid, energy efficiency. That's a difficult one to deal with in rate spread and rate design.
Okay, anything else from anybody? Well, this was a really wonderful panel. If part of the goal was to come out here, express a particular business case for having the PUC take a look at this issue, develop, as Phil has mentioned, develop policy, develop a dialogue about all of this here at the agency, mission absolutely accomplished. And I think, we'll have to convene and figure out what the marketplace looks like, what the rate design should look like, and how we begin to dip our toe in this. So really well done. Thank you very much for your time this morning.
Thank you.
Okay, we will break for lunch and reconvene at 1 o'clock. Thank you.